All right. Hello, and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker. And today we are doing kind of a discussion show. I think for the most part, the agreed upon format will be an informal discussion between Tavo San Abri, otherwise known by the alias Professor Owl. I think that was given to you by beloved Pelagia there. So, do you, which one do you prefer, Professor Owl or the Tavo?
I mean, Professor Owl is. I don't know that maybe I've used that in some video titles, but Apology is the one who dubbed me as Professor Owl. So I don't think I've ever gone by that as like, "Hi, I'm Professor Owl." I think that's mostly. But people in the atheist community do know me as Professor Owl because of Apologia's video. So, and Mr. Deity is a really big atheist who's got a few 100,000 subscribers, and he did a video about me recently, and I think he referred to me in a somewhat similar way. So I'm kind of used to it either way.
Gotcha. And Phil Bair, you don't have any aliases, but yeah, Phil, welcome to the show on your end. Hope you're doing good.
Yeah, I actually, I I was given an alias once,
Mm.
and because somebody said that I looked like the villain in Flash Gordon, and I don't remember what the villain in Flash Gordon's name is.
Ming the Merciless.
Ming the
Oh,
Merciless. Okay,
okay. Yeah, I can
so
see it.
so yeah, I was dubbed Ming the Merciless once, and I think it was I'm trying to remember who dubbed me that. In fact, he made up a graphic of my face with Ming the Merciless's goatee, the way that the goatee is styled in Ming the Merciless, and he put a hat on me, and he took my picture and transformed it into Ming the Merciless, and then posted it up on social media and said Phil Bair is Ming the Merciless in disguise. And so I thought about coming up with something like Phil the Merciless, or I don't know, but that's the only moniker I've ever been given.
He
But
was
All right.
he was played by Max von Sydow.
that's
A
right.
great actor, one of my favorite actors of all time.
Oh yeah, great actor. Yep. So see,
Awesome.
we agree on something already.
There we go. Off to a great start. So yeah,
Yeah.
convert Tavo. Let's no. So just so the audience knows. So yeah, basically the plan of action today is look. Tavo San Abri has made some a reputation for himself among Christians, but also some pretty famous atheists like Mr. Deity, James Fedor, even the History Valley podcast, and that sort of thing. Let alone Apologia. And you've made a reputation for yourself because look, you were a lifelong committed atheist for I think about 40 years, if I remember correctly. Well, actually, and you've recently come out as giving some evidence in favor of Jesus and saying, look, there's something special about Christianity. And, obviously, this has kind of ruffled some feathers among your atheistic community online. And some of them have said, well, I doubt Tavo was ever even really an atheist. He couldn't really be one of us. He was never a true skeptic, kind of thing. And so I wanted to kind of bring you on to give you a chance to speak with Phil and give you a chance to say, there are some certain issues that prevent you from fully committing to Christ. And I want to see if we can, have Phil address some of those issues. What is it that is preventing you from crossing the line and fully committing to Jesus and that sort of thing? But yeah, I'm just kind of curious, Tavo, on your end, before we begin, what do you make of the fact that atheists are kind of questioning your past as a committed atheist? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's one of the common things. I would talk to other atheists, and this never was the case with me, but people who had left Christianity, right? And what Christians would often say to them is, "You were never really a real Christian," you know. So it kind of turns into the no true Scotsman fallacy. But on the other hand, I mean, I can see why people would say, if you were really a skeptic, you would not believe this. I think there's it's not a totally irrational belief, but it is a way of just sort of shutting down the validity of the person you're talking to before they get a chance to say anything by just, and really it's kind of still an ad hominem attack, right? My point is, don't worry about what my background is. Like, look at these arguments and argue against the arguments themselves. I will say, as I've said to you before, I think one of the most potent arguments for Christianity that's emerged on my channel is the degree to which the response to the things that I've said has been so acerbic, so acrimonious. There are so many people who have said, and I as I've kind of joked around with you, like I might start like a side channel of like, I'm just gonna like walk up to like, people's mothers and punch them in the face just to see how bad the comments are, and they probably won't be as bad as the comments that I've gotten on my channel, like "F you loser," profanity. Somebody accused me of stolen valor, which is horrific, and they said their justification was that I'm a university professor, and they said I was identifying myself as a university professor, and a very contrived justification, but so I've been accused of really horrific, terrible things, and just so many people, like it's a barrage of negative statements, and it's almost like I wonder if I were just, why don't you just say you're wrong and here's why? Like, that's really not the response. It really does feel like there's something more substantive to it. So and I don't think that's real evidence, but that has been a very interesting anecdotal experience. Just the fact that people are reacting not only negatively, but with, barrage of profanity, really like statements of tremendous ridicule, it's really been
predominantly from the one side you're finding, from the skeptical or atheist community.
More often than not. I will say, like, a couple of Christians, like when I put out that video about hell, have said like, you're going to go to hell. So is that there's clearly voices on both sides that are really just more interested in being negative and acerbic, but
fair enough.
But it's definitely been a more bilious reaction from the atheist side. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Cool. Well. Guess what, Tavo? Today is your chance to prove yourself to the skeptics and say that we're going to be dealing with Tavo the skeptic and what some of your objections are. But Phil, just before we get into the openings, because I know Tavo has a case to present here with slides. I'm kind of curious in terms of your own background, for the audience's sake. So some people might be coming from Tavo's channel and they haven't heard of you before. Did you yourself have any bouts with skepticism or atheism or anything like that before you became a Christian?
You're asking me, right?
Yeah, just for the audience that doesn't know you. Yeah.
Well, yeah. My background is, I was raised in a Christian home. My father was a Methodist minister, and so the truth of Christianity was pretty much assumed in my household as I was growing up. And when I went to the University of Iowa and majored in philosophy, my professors at the University of Iowa just ripped me to shreds. And they were extremely hostile to Christian students. And so that really shook my faith down to the core. And I went home on the weekends from college and told my mother that I was considering leaving Christianity because it is so philosophically inept. And my father had already passed away by then. He passed away when I was 9 years old. He was killed in a train accident. And so it was just my mother, and my mother panicked when I told her that I was casting doubt over everything that I was raised to believe. And so she went to her friends and said, what am I going to do? Phil's about to become a non-Christian. And her friends said, well, if Phil is passionate about philosophy, and I was, then get him a book by a Christian philosopher. So she did. She bought me a book by a guy named Francis Schaeffer, and I got it in the mail when I was at my college dorm, and I read through that book, and that book changed my life, not because everything that Schaeffer argued was necessarily valid, but what it taught me was that Christianity is not devoid of philosophical teeth. You know, there's philosophical muscle in Christianity, and I never realized that. And so it pretty much set me on a lifelong pursuit. So the antagonism toward Christianity and toward my faith personally came from my college professors. And I am actually grateful that all of that occurred, because what it did was it made me realize that it's better to have all of your dominoes knocked over than to have them standing up for the wrong reasons. So that's kind of where my history lies. But I sympathize with Tavo when you encounter such hostility, because it's not just atheists, or and not all atheists are like this, but it's not just people saying, hey, I think you're wrong about this. It's people saying, I think you're a horrible human being, and I have all the justification in the world to ridicule you and to impugn your character simply because of what you believe, because you disagree with me. You know, so that's, you know, it is kind of a curious phenomenon, but I think it's understandable. If the Christian worldview is true, then it is abundantly understandable, to be real honest. So
awesome. Yeah, and Tavo, your buddy KJX here, and he's saying, so Tavo is a skeptic now, and well, for today's purposes, the format of the show, the idea of the show is, Tavo has come out and he supports various Christian doctrines like the resurrection and his deity, but Tavo has certain objections against full-on biblical Christianity, and we wanted to discuss those. So yeah, in a sense, Tavo's sitting in sort of the skeptic's chair. And with that, he's going to be grilling Phil, and Phil's going to, follow 1 Peter 3:15, see if we can give Tavo an answer or a consideration that may change his mind on that front. So,
yeah. And I just wanted to make a comment real quick that I applaud that kind of skepticism. I think that's healthy skepticism. What Tavo and I both probably object to is this unhealthy skepticism, this radical skepticism, and this mean-spirited skepticism. That's what I object to. I have no objections to someone who has doubts and who is skeptical of some of the principles that I believe in, that I've committed myself to. That's fine with me. I don't have any problem with that at all. In fact, I encourage that kind of skepticism. So that's something that I celebrate, and that's one reason why I'm looking forward to this conversation with Tavo, because Tavo is a sincere skeptic. He's not, I don't see him as a hostile skeptic. I see him as a sincere one. And he's committed to truth and committed to intellectual integrity. So to me, I welcome that kind of conversation.
Awesome. All right, cool. So yeah, Tavo, with that said, I will turn it over to you to give kind of your opening case as Tavo the skeptic here. And if you want, I'll bring up your slides.
That'd be great, yeah.
All right, there you go.
First of all, let me go back to the beginning.
And do you want it full screen or?
Full screen would be fine, yeah.
Okay.
Some of the text is kind of small. All right, so first of all, I'm really glad that KJEC is here. Just to refer to your question, am I a skeptic now? I would argue that I've always been skeptical, so I would argue that that's not changed. But no, this PowerPoint is mostly, and by the way, I reformatted this PowerPoint from Keynote just a few minutes ago, so some of the formatting may be off and some of the text is kind of small. So I do apologize if it's not a great PowerPoint, and I may revise this into its own video if people are interested. So that's a question that I'd love to hear your input in the comment section. So if you're commenting on this video, let me know if you think that this should deserve its own video on my channel. But what I'm going to focus on is what I call a list of moral indictments of Christianity. Now, as I've said on my channel several times, mostly in the comment section, not in videos, but I've said this to a lot of people. A lot of people are aware of this. I'm not 100% committed to any theological worldview. I would argue that I'm still theologically non-committed. So I've said this before, that I think there's about a 55% probability that that God exists. So I'm not 100% sure about that. But I think there's a much higher probability that if there is a God, that Jesus is a figure who had some divine authority. So there are three reasons why I'm theologically non-committed. The first one is my overall personal epistemic humility. That's not a counterfactual argument. I'm not playing devil's advocate here. I'm really expressing my own belief. But the second reason I feel like is, as an academic, as somebody who's a scholar who's on YouTube giving these arguments from what I'm trying to keep as a lens that's very academic, I think a degree of neutrality is important from just, the dialectical perspective. Now, as some of you know, I'm a professor. I don't have any theological credentials, so I don't want anyone to take away from this any personal theological advice. So this is not theological advice. I am a professor. I'm a professor in a very different field. I'm also an editor for 2 different journals in my own field. So, and I'm also one of the top-rated manuscript reviewers in my field in the history of the main journal of my field. So what I try to do is I try to take the academic rules that I've learned from other disciplines and apply them to theological questions. So with that in mind, that's why I'm trying to stay generally scholarly neutral, at least from some perspective when I do a lot of the videos that I do. But what I'm going to focus most on this video is the third point, the moral indictment. I think that Christianity has failed on a moral basis for a lot of reasons, and I'm going to go into those reasons, and that's most of what this video is about. Now, I will say that these are the things that I'm relatively more certain about, and I'm not citing a lot of evidence for this, but I would refer you all to my CTF argument. So the first thing I'm fairly convinced about is that if any major world religion is correct, then the divinity of Jesus is likely the strongest claim that any of the religions have to pose. Now, that's from the CTF argument, so I'll refer you to on the separate video. Check out the separate videos on my channel on the CTF argument, because that goes into a lot of very quantitative evidence. The second thing that I'm reasonably certain about is that if you use inference to the best explanation, you have a good case in the events of the first century to consider the divinity of Jesus. Okay, I don't think there's a single explanation that explains the birth of Christianity, the events around the death of Jesus, as well as just the divinity of Jesus. Third, I think that Jesus was a good moral teacher. I think he was important. I think he had a lot of good values. That's probably a topic for another video. I've also sort of demonstrated that quantitatively in the CTF argument. All right, the fourth thing I want to emphasize is that as I've gotten to know the teachings of Jesus, I'm very certain that my life has gotten better. And the fifth thing that I want to say, and I think this is broadly an important point for atheists to consider, is that being in a community of believers, I'm sure that's made my life better. But there are many, many, many studies that all underscore, and these are systemic meta-analyses. These are very strong studies, there's very strong evidence that being a part of a community of believers has really important benefits, health benefits, personal benefits, increasing longevity. You actually get a 7-year increase in your life expectancy by being a participant in a religious community. Now, that's an important idea, not just for this debate, but also broadly. As society gets more secular, gets more atheistic, which is a trend that's happening, we should keep that in mind, because we are simultaneously living in an epidemic of loneliness. So maybe it's a topic for a separate video, but just something I wanted to bring up. All right, now getting into the moral indictments of Christianity, there is solid doctrine from scriptural resources that indicate that divine favor is not a permanent inheritance. If you look at 1 Samuel, there's the story of the Israelites losing their favor with God, and the ark gets taken away from them. If you look at Ezekiel 10, there's stories about the glory of God departing the temple, God's presence leaving the temple. Isaiah, really eloquently spells out that if you worship God, but you don't pursue causes that are just, God does not want that worship. God wants justice. God wants us to care for each other. And if we don't do that and we're just worshiping based on a perfunctory or tacit obligation, that's not something that God wants. I think this is really well delineated in the scriptural resources that exist. Now, here's what I'm going to say in this talk is that Christianity claims moral authority that it's not earned. And we're going to talk about 5 different moral indictments that show that Christianity has, if either doesn't have moral authority or has lost moral authority that it has. The first one is environmental neglect. The most famous phrase of Christianity is God so loves the world, right? That's John 3:16. But if you look at all these other scriptural quotations, it shows that there is definitely a respect for the world, a respect for the environment. And yet, Christianity has not only not supported that cause, but has actively worked to antagonize that cause. In Pew Research, only, white evangelical Protestants are one of the lowest groups in terms of believing in global warming. The Cornwall Alliance is an active evangelical coalition arguing against and opposing any legislation to help make the world a better place. And as deforestation, environmental degradation, desertification, ocean acidification all become markedly worsened, Christianity has not only been silent, not only complicit, but has made the situation demonstrably worse by lobbying against these causes. All right, the other moral indictment that I have is legalism over human dignity, right? I've made a video about this, about the fact that, same-sex love or same-gender love is not something that Christianity should have ever condemned. I believe that the condemnation of homosexuality is not a biblical condemnation. I believe it's not biblically rooted. And even though I have been like a really strident advocate for a lot of Christian values, I have on my channel received a lot of negative feedback. And I'll just tell you personally, my anecdotal experience on this has been really, really harmful. Now, I'll give you just one example. I've been going to a church. The pastor of that church has told me personally, you got to take down this video. Now that you can't imagine how hurtful that was to me. And that's a tiny fraction. That's a tiny percentage of families that are being torn apart, of people who are being forced to deny their relationships, to deny who they are, to deny their love. And that's all happening because of Christianity. And I would argue that even the strongest case that I could make for a biblical condemnation is still very, very weak. All right. Now, there's also the issue of silence on usury in the debt crisis. Usury is one of the most clearly moral, it's one of the most important moral edicts of scriptural resources, right? Jesus rails against the people who are money changers in the temple. There are so many scriptural resources that indicate that usury is a terrible thing. And what has Christianity done? Well, the debt crisis has increased iteratively over each and every generation. Absolutely nothing. Institutional Christianity has been silent, if not complicit, on this point as well. And this is really important because as this problem gets worse, we're turning into a world of debtor slaves, both on an individual, a societal, and a national level. So this is a real crisis. In my mind, this is one of the biggest crises. And, the issue of slavery and Christianity has been like a really big talking point among atheistic and apologetical arguments. But I'm going to tell you, exploitation of others, if you don't believe in this, this is one of the ways that Christianity could have one of the highest appeal to younger generations. I tell you, if Christianity got on the bandwagon, yes, usury is wrong. Yes, these practices of predatory lending should be curbed. That would make Christianity so much more in line with scriptural resources, and at the same time, it would make Christianity so much more in line with the interest of younger generations. But again, Christianity has been silent on this, and it's an utter moral failure. Indifference to animal welfare. Again, there's a lot of scriptural resources. So I'm not going to go into a lot of the details, but this is something that I've written a lot about in my books. The fact that we treat animals so poorly. Jesus says you'll be judged by the way you treat the least among you. This is, again, a moral indictment, a moral failure, and there's never been any adequate response to Christianity saying that we should treat animals better. And we know that we're causing the suffering not of millions, but of billions of animals. 99% of farm animals are in horrific conditions, and yet there's no organized Christian response to this. And I think this shows an indifference to suffering that is a huge moral indictment. The last thing I'll talk about is the expropriation of Christianity by self-aggrandizing groups. There was a push towards fundamentalism from an investment of some $300 million around the turn of the century. This was a push towards fundamentalism, which culminated in the Niagara Creed, and this created the verbal and plenary interpretation of the Bible. That's been, I think, very deeply problematic. Also, at the same time, prosperity gospel has really increased. We're living in an era where megachurches are exploiting, are fleecing the blue-collar class, are fleecing the impoverished to a much higher degree than any other population. We have people who are going into credit card debt just so that they can support their churches, because that's what they're being told by people who are completely unscrupulous. Creflo Dollar, Kenneth Copeland, Joel Osteen, the list goes on. as these groups have emerged and as these groups have been increasingly leeches, increasingly parasitic on society, there has been absolutely no adequate response from Christian organizations to protest this, to wrest back the identity of Jesus from these organizations. And instead, what has happened is there's been this definitional drift that's emerged where Christianity becomes increasingly associated with groups that are really morally repugnant. So because of these 5 indictments, I feel like, there has been a huge moral failure of Christianity. Now, as a result of that, I feel like that is perhaps the most potent argument for non-identification of Christianity. So there's the label has become meaningless. There's been a definitional drift as the identity of Christianity has become increasingly exploited by organizations, by people who are really, really unscrupulous. And my anecdotal experience has been that there is a real movement that is already emerging where people say, I don't want to call myself Christian because I'm taking on a lot of a political agenda. I'm taking on a sociological agenda, and I'm taking on a bunch of practices that I don't want to defend. And there's, I've interacted with some people on my channel who they call themselves the Way. Now, these are people who are sort of inspired by the original Acts era naming of Christians. So before people used the identity Christian, the people in the book of Acts who were early, the proto-Christians, called themselves the Way. I've at least been inspired by some of those people. Some people call themselves sort of red letter Christians or big picture Christians. I think there is a movement, even as Christianity is waning in popularity, there is a movement of people who still want to engage with the teachings of Jesus. I think there's also a utility in this. Independent voices outside of the hierarchy of Christianity are really important. I think just having that sort of dialectical influence from speakers and voices outside of the Christian community who argue that there's a moral indictment of Christianity is increasingly important as Christianity loses its moral footing in so many ways. And the last thing I'll say is there is a really important itinerant teacher tradition in Christianity. Justin Martyr made a really great case. Basically, a lot of Justin Martyr's apologetics are based on the fact that society was becoming more moral because the Christian community was more moral and was doing things that were almost superhuman feats of morality, according to the words of Justin Martyr. And to him, this was the best argument for Christianity. Around the time of Justin Martyr, there were also these other itinerant teachers. Now, that doesn't exist in any other religious tradition. But the important point that I want to make here is that the itinerant teacher tradition is very vital to Christianity, and it also underscores a really important point that teacher tradition originally argued that Christianity was persuasive because it's moral. I would argue that people are losing faith in Christianity or walking away from Christianity because it's immoral. So what we're seeing is the converse of that occurring. And I would argue that there's at least some statistical evidence that supports my anecdotal observation that even as the enthusiasm for Christianity wanes, there are still a lot of people who are really enthusiastic about relating to Jesus directly, learning more about the teachings of Jesus, and supporting Jesus and identification with Jesus, even though they don't want to identify as Christians. So those are my moral indictments. That's the moral case why I don't associate as much with Christianity. So I think that's the last slide. Yeah, that's the last slide. Awesome. All right. So I hope that wasn't too verbose and didn't go on for too long.
No, that was perfect. Yeah, and very well constructed. I think it's easy to follow your main objections. So before we go to the informal dialogue, I do want to be fair and give Phil, if he wants it, a chance to give your own kind of opening. You've heard Tavo's case. Do you want to kind of give a general response to them before you guys go into the dialogue?
Yeah, my general response is I think he's right. I think Christianity is false, and I'm going to stop being a Christian.
Okay, that not going how I wanted it to go, but okay. but yeah, no. If there is anything in general you wanted to say, if you just want to dive into the discussion, it's up to you.
Well, before I comment on the substance of what Tavo just presented, I want to steelman it, and I want to do that in a substantial way, and because if Christians behave badly, then the world has a right to indict Christianity. That is simply a fact of life, and it's something that Christians need to be aware of. Christians need to be aware that they are representing Christ in the world, on the world stage, and they have a responsibility to represent Christ in in a way that's meaningful and accurate and shows integrity. And if Christians don't, if they don't present a picture and a model of Christianity to the world that is accurate and is full of integrity, then they can't complain if the world rejects Christianity itself. Now, I mentioned earlier that Francis Schaeffer is one of my favorite theologians and philosophers. And Francis Schaeffer taught me a very important lesson, and that is that if Christians don't love each other, the world has a right to deny that we are followers of Christ. So let me say that again. If Christians do not love each other, then the world has a right to deny that we are authentic disciples of Christ. Because Jesus said, by this you will know, by this the world will know that you are my disciples, that if you have love one for another. So the way that Christians present themselves to the world is extremely critical. And if we fail to present ourselves in the world as having integrity and following Christ accurately and truthfully, then we have lost our moral authority, the way that Tavo puts it. We've lost our moral authority, not because Christianity is false, but because we have failed to represent Christianity in a meaningful and accurate way. So that pretty much leads me to my general observation about Tavo's presentation. That is that what Tavo's presentation is basically saying is Christians have failed. Christians have behaved badly. Therefore, Christianity lacks credibility. And I think that is a fundamental logical fallacy. Because Christianity and the way Christians behave are not the same thing. So if Christians behave badly, that doesn't mean that Christianity lacks integrity or credibility. It just simply means that Christians are behaving badly. That's the only conclusion that you can come to. You can't come to any conclusion about the credibility of Christianity itself or the credibility of Jesus Christ himself based on the behavior of Christians and their moral failures. So I have a lot of objections, and I dispute a lot of the arguments that Tavo has made. I don't think that they're framed properly and accurately in many cases, but let's just assume that they are. Let's assume that every single moral indictment that Tavo presented was valid. So if we assume that for the sake of argument, my comment about that would be that still says nothing about Christianity. It says nothing about Christianity. It says a lot about the failure of Christians, and that is all. The failure of Christians does not imply the failure of Christianity. And if those things are kept separate, I think that those objections lose their force. But I want to make sure that I make this clear. They lose their epistemic force, but they don't lose their moral force. And what I mean by that is that when I mentioned earlier is central to this discussion, that if Christians behave badly, then we can't blame the world for rejecting Christianity. But we can criticize the critics of Christianity for confusing the Christian community with the Christian faith itself. We can criticize the critic for that, but we can't criticize the critic for rejecting Christianity because we are the ones that are supposed to be representing Christianity. And if we represent it badly, then we cannot complain if someone rejects Christianity on that basis. So that's kind of like my overall assessment of the situation. And there was something else that I wanted to say, and I don't remember what it was. So hopefully I'll remember it during the course of the conversation. A lot of things drop out of my head constantly. I don't know whether it's because I didn't have breakfast or what, or I didn't sleep last night. I didn't get to sleep until 4 a.m. So I'm not necessarily at the top of my game today, but those are kind of the basic observations. And so I'd like to hear, Tavo, what your response to that would be.
Well, Tavo, just before you guys get into, I do see we have like three general questions from the audience that might be helpful, just on this general question of understanding what Christianity proper is and that sort of thing. So, on that front, first question is from James, and it's for you, Tavo, and he's saying, if there were a Christian community, let's say there is at least one Christian community that agrees with you on every single point, would you then commit to the Christian church and become a Christian fully at that point?
I don't think so, right? Because I would first, there's two reasons why. First of all, I would consider that organization to be an outlier, right? Second of all, I don't know that I need somebody to agree with me on every single point, right? There's going to be disagreements. There's going to be like, I would, here's the truth. I would be happy to be a part of a community that doesn't agree with me, because if I'm disagreeing with people and learning and they're being respectful, I think that's fine. I will tell you, it was really disheartening after a year of being spiritually homeless, or after years, I should say, of being spiritually homeless, and after several years of being actually physically homeless, that I finally feel like I have a spiritual home. I finally feel like I'm identifying with the teachings of Jesus. I found a community that I was going to have the pastor of that community say, you have to take down this video. I can't tell you how disheartening that was. Now, that doesn't make me want to stop going there, but I think I could see that in the future that somebody from that community is going to say, hey, we should kick this guy out of our community. So it's really more not what would I join, would any other organization have me? Okay, that's the first thing. But I will say I would be happy to join an organization that I don't agree with on all these points. But I feel like these are such obvious moral failings that to not care about them at all, I think is problematic. But I would also say that if I found an organization that's an outlier, I would still say, wow, you guys are a real outlier. And I think that if they're morally sound, they would admit that they're outliers as well.
Okay, all right. And we have a question specifically for you, Phil, from Skeptic named KJ.
Can I comment on that answer first?
Yeah, sorry. Okay. Go ahead. Yeah.
So this is another case where we have to differentiate between Christians and Christianity, because if a Christian community agrees with you on every point, and they agree that in general the world, the body of Christ has failed morally, they may be an outlier. But you studied the Bible, Tavo. I believe that you studied the Bible, and if you studied the Bible, you know very well that it is usually the remnant that got it right, and that the majority got it wrong. Jesus said that the way is wide that leads to destruction, and the way is narrow that leads to life, and few are those who find it. So the fact that a Christian community that actually shows integrity is an outlier shouldn't surprise anybody, because that's pretty much the nature of the beast. The majority of the Christian world is made up of Christians who are not getting things right, who are not doing things very well. They're not following Jesus very closely. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not Christians. It just means that they're bad Christians. And in my opinion, and if you've ever read my books, Tavo, you will know that this is a very strong theme in my theology. I think the body of Christ and the Christian community at large, as a whole, is sick. I think it is unhealthy. I think it has been invaded by a lot of foreign ideologies and a lot of anti-Christian misunderstandings. And so, and fallacies. I mean, and I have made the comment on several occasions that Christians are notorious for being the worst epistemologists on the planet. And you'll hear Christians saying, "Oh, I know that I know that I know that I know." And when they claim that they know something, the basis for that knowledge is absolutely sparse and pretty much invalid. And so there is a moral sickness in the body of Christ, in the Christian community, in the entire world in general. There is an epistemological syndrome where Christians are practicing anti-epistemology, and so I think the fact that a Christian community that agrees with you on every point, and we're assuming that if they agree with you on every point, then they are being morally virtuous. And I would dispute that claim, but I will assume it on the basis of the argument. Just for the sake of argument, I'll assume that a Christian community that agrees with you on every point is a valid Christian community. And if they are an outlier, then that is what I would expect. It wouldn't surprise me a bit. So the fact that a Christian community that agrees with you on every point is an outlier really doesn't mean very much, doesn't carry very much epistemic weight, even though it carries a lot of meaning in terms of how people will respond emotionally to the Christian community and to so much of the corruption that exists in the Christian community as a whole, at large. So.
Well, I mean, I have several responses to that. Now, Dale, I also, these are kind of grouped in with my responses to Phil's kind of opening statement. So if you want to go to the next question first and then come back to them, I'm happy to do that.
Well, yeah, I think Phil's kind of answered this. So our friend Kajak is saying, look, Phil, pretend I start a new religion and everyone in that religion is running around naked and just slapping everyone. What would you think of that religion? Now, I know he's raising it as a silly point, but I think what the serious thing is behind it is, look, we do judge religions based on what their congregants do. And right. Even in the Bible, we're told to judge Christians by their fruit and stuff like that. So I think that's the serious point behind what he's saying.
Yeah, and I applaud that comment. I applaud that question, because the question, what would I think of that religion, is there are two parts to that question. There are two parts to my answer, actually. The first part of my answer is I wouldn't think much of it. I would have an emotional reaction to that religion that would be negative. But that wouldn't be the end of the story, because what I would ask is running around naked and slapping people, are those inherent teachings and components of that religion? And if that religion teaches that people should go around naked and slap everybody, then I would say that religion is faulty. But this question does not answer the deepest question of all, and that is, what does that religion really teach? What are the essential teachings and doctrines of that religion? And when people run around naked and slap people, are they acting consistently with that religion, or are they acting inconsistently with that religion? If they're acting inconsistently with that religion, then I have to suspend judgment about the merits of that religion, simply because I don't know what that religion teaches yet, and I can't judge a religion by those outward forms, because those outward forms may be an anomaly, and they might not actually conform to the essential teachings of the religion. So if you want to apply that question to Christianity, then my answer is the same answer I gave before. Christians have a responsibility to represent Christianity in a way that is faithful, in a way that shows integrity. If they don't, then if if the world doesn't think much of Christianity, then it's our fault. It's not their fault. It's not the world's fault if they look at our behavior and reject Christianity on that basis. I don't blame them.
All right, right
if this religion did have proponents, if it had advocates, this theoretical religion, they'd be called slapologists.
Nice.
You're giving KJEC ideas, Tavo. Let's go back. He's going to go out and do this. But
well played, Tavo. Well played.
All right. So I think at this point, I'll take a break on the questions, but I will go over them and raise them later on. But I want Tavo and Phil to now go into the official informal dialogue. And Phil, you've heard. Well, Tavo, I'll start with you actually. So you've heard Phil's basic response. Are there any specific objections you want to discuss with him first?
Yeah, I mean, I have 4 objections to the underlying argument that you can sort of decouple the persuasiveness of Christianity from the moral behavior of Christians. This is 4 arguments for that. Now, first of all, you cited Francis Schaeffer. Now, do we know what the organization was that he actually started? Does anyone know?
Well, he started L'Abri in Switzerland.
That's right. And and who you're talking to?
Pardon me?
Tavo San Abri. That's the same word, right? Abri. L'Abri means just the Abri. That's just my last name. I just thought I thought I'd mention that. All right. So I have 4 arguments. The first is the sociological argument, right? So even if you say, well, this is logically fallacious and I dispute it for that reason, sociologically, it doesn't really matter if you say that, because the tendency is that these people have a proclivity to move away from Christianity. So I understand the logical basis of you saying this is actually fallacious, you're making an ad hominem attack, that doesn't really address the root of Christianity. But the problem is, even if you win that argument, you lose the argument sociologically, because the persuasiveness is still borne out by people's moral behavior.
Yeah, and I think I already acknowledged that, by the way.
Yeah, I think that's an important thing to keep in mind against the argument that, it's not about logical proof here. It's about what's happening sociologically. I think the second important point is there is a historical apologetical argument for Christianity that's made based on the moral behavior of Christians, right? This was one of the strongest arguments. This is why Christianity became such a force in the Roman Empire, because they were doing away with immoral practices like infanticide. Like, Christians became essentially the roots of what would later grow into the adoption practice. Hospitals not necessarily spawned from Christianity in isolation, but Christianity at least significantly contributed to the practice of providing care for the indigent, for the poor, for the under-resourced. My point is this, that this is an apologetical argument. You can't have it both ways. So if you're saying the apologetical argument is that people should join Christianity because look how moral Christians are, then the problem is you lose that argument historically when things start moving the other direction. All right. The third thing that I want to say is, I think
by the way, can I interrupt? I'm going to forget what the first points are by the time you reach the last point. So I'm not going to be able to respond to these because you're giving me all of them at once, and I'm not going to remember them all.
Well, we can go back, or when we get to the informal conversation, we can talk about these things individually. Or I think some of the other questions from the group will also address this, because my third argument is basically the conversation from the roots of slapology, which is KJEC's new religion that he's starting, and that's that it does argue against divine influence and authority. If I walk into a church and I see people who are of such low moral fiber that I think it's a strong argument, and it's an easy argument to be made, that there is no true divine influence in their presence, that they are not in the presence of God, and whatever they're doing wrong. I mean, KJEC made that point with his question, but I think it's an argument that I wanted to make. And the last thing that I'll say is, who defines consistency here? You're saying, yeah, there's a lot of Christians who have immoral behavior, there's a lot of problematic Christians, there's a lot of practices, but these are not true Christian practices. Well, this gets into the no true Scotsman fallacy. All right, like, if you're defining what's a true Christian, I'm sure you could define it in a very moral and very narrow way. But the problem is that definition is not enacted by the rest of the Christian population. And as a result of that, I think that makes your argument lose its persuasiveness. You're saying, like, if you're the one who gets to define consistent, like I could define this is not truly Christian and this is, and that would take care of the argument. But the problem is, I'm not the authority on who defines that. Christianity comes with Christian dogma and Christian doctrine, and that dogma and doctrine is flawed. And if you say, well, the majority of it is not scriptural, the majority of it is non-biblical, then I still think, you're relying on a very idiosyncratic definition to save the argument. All right, that's probably it. But I did want to respond to those things before we got too far in the conversation.
Okay. Well, we can. I don't know if we want to take them in order or not, but I'll take the last comment that you made, and the last point that you made, because it's the one that I remember. It's the last one you mentioned, so it's still fresh in my mind. So I think there's a mistake being made here, and that is the assumption that I am personally and arbitrarily defining the contours of Christianity. And therefore, if someone doesn't conform to my supposedly idiosyncratic definition of Christianity, therefore I can rule them out as authentic Christians. And that's not really my position. My position is not that Phil Bair defines the contours of Christianity, and therefore that's the watershed for how to judge the behavior of Christians. My argument is that there is a specific revelation that defines the doctrines of Christianity. I did not define those doctrines. There was an external revelation that defined those doctrines, and how well we understand that revelation and how well we apply it and live by it, that is what defines the merits of any individual Christian. And therefore it defines the merits of Christian groups, all of which behave in a similar fashion. So when you say that a person who might walk into a worship service and those people are behaving badly in some way, then you would conclude that they are not in the presence of God. I would say, well, you can conclude that, and I'm not going to argue with that. But that doesn't address the deeper issue. The deeper issue is there faith, and is there doctrinal systematic that we call Christianity? Does it hang together, and does it have a specific content, and is there some divine authority behind it? The fact that there is no divine authority behind the misbehavior of Christians during any given worship service doesn't mean there's no divine authority behind Christianity itself. And so it still comes back to differentiating between whether or not Christianity is defined by the collective behavior of Christians in the world. And so, and not only that, but there really is there's no definable collective behavior of Christians in the world, because you can find a lot of these aberrations and a lot of these problematic areas where Christians are behaving badly, and the sheer frequency of that might lead you to believe that this is the majority of Christians, and that the ones who are actually showing integrity are the outliers. I'm not sure that that's necessarily a defensible position. And there have been some comments that have said that a lot of Christians have done exactly what Christ commanded, that they have acted with integrity. They have set up organizations that care for the poor and care for the indigent. And I'm pretty sure that if you check out to the sociological evidence, that the majority of people who conduct charitable activities in the world and in history were people of faith, and a lot of those were actually Christians. So it was the Christian community that led the abolitionist movement, for example. And so this idea that Christians routinely side with questionable or unethical objectives and unethical practices and agendas is kind of weak, because it really doesn't form a comprehensive understanding of how Christians have behaved routinely over the course of the world. A lot of times what we see objections, and those objections appear to be extremely strong to us simply because of our emotional reaction to them. And that doesn't necessarily give us an objective picture. But again, even if it did, you could dispute everything I just said and say that the majority of Christians behave badly, majority of Christians are involved in corrupt activities and in corrupt objectives and corrupt agendas and so on. Even if that's true, it still doesn't address the basic understanding of what Christianity is based on the revelation and based on the teachings of Jesus. And so this idea of the sociological argument as opposed to the analytical argument, I think that's a false dichotomy. The analytical argument is still important, even if the sociological argument fails. So if I fail to demonstrate that Christianity is credible or has any merits to it, if I fail to demonstrate that because the sociological evidence is working against me, then I accept that. I accept that conclusion. Perhaps Christians have failed in the sociological argument, and Christians may have failed to convince society in a broad sense that Christianity is credible and is true. And that's on us. That is a failure of the Christian community, and I accept that indictment and I agree with it. But again, that doesn't negate the analytic argument. It simply makes it harder to see because people are responding emotionally to something, and their emotional response is understandable. And so I respect the sociological aspect of all of this. It's just that it can't be the end of the story. It's not the whole story. It's only part of the story.
Well, let me ask you a counterfactual then. Let's say I'm listening to this conversation so far, and I've said, well, the consensus of these viewpoints is that Jesus has some merits, but Christianity has gone astray. What's to stop me from, as an observer of this conversation, walking away from the conversation saying Christianity is false, but Jesus was a good moral teacher? I'm going to be a good person. I'm going to look at the teachings of Jesus. I'll read about those teachings, but I don't think he was divine, and then walk away from the conversation at that point.
Well, I'm sure you've heard
What's
of
your response to that as a takeaway point?
Yeah, I'm sure you've heard of the trilemma, because if you walk away from the conversation saying, okay, I'm gonna confine my attitude toward Jesus to his moral teaching, and say he was a great moral teacher, but he wasn't divine. If that's the case, then you have a serious problem on your hands. And that is that if Jesus is a serious moral teacher, then and he misrepresented who he was, then that negates the idea that he was a serious moral teacher, because a moral teacher is not going to deliberately misrepresent himself and tell people that he is somebody that he is not. And so
that's C.S. Lewis's trilemma that he argues, but I think that's an easily avoidable pitfall of this counterfactual. And the way of avoiding that is just saying, well, I'm going to read the teachings of Jesus. I'm going to take away what I like. I'll try to be a good moral person. Jesus was a good teacher. He had some good lessons, but some of his lessons were distorted. He never said he was divine. And then that's the end of the conversation for me. And I'll just go my own separate way. Like, what's your argument to persuade me that that's not the correct synthesis of these conflicting viewpoints?
I think my response to that would be that you're not taking a fringe idea that Jesus taught and throwing it away and keeping the substance, because Jesus' identity was the substance of his teaching. His moral teaching was secondary to the primary substance of his teaching, which was, I am the Son of God. I am God in human form, and I have come to be the Savior of the world. I have not come to make you good people. I have come to give you life. And so that is the central component of his teaching. And so to treat it as a fringe component and say, well, I'm just going to pick and choose in a smorgasbord fashion. I'm going to choose his moral teaching and I'm going to ignore the teaching about his identity, is to throw away the substance, throw away the centrality of his teaching. And so that's why I don't think it works. C.S. Lewis would say misrepresenting yourself or being mistaken about who you are and thinking that you are actually the creator of the universe in human form is the ultimate insanity. And it is incongruous to say that someone who is that mistaken about this ultimate claim of being God in human form cannot be considered a moral teacher, that it just simply does not work. And so, I mean, that's the way that I don't think you can escape it. I don't think that selectivism allows you to escape it. I think that's pretty much a weak escape, and I don't think it's an escape hatch at all. So,
well, I'll turn it back over to you, Dale, and I don't know if you want to take more questions from the audience. I have responses to that I could say. But...
Okay. Well, I guess. Okay. So if you want me to turn it back to the audience, then
or it's a detail, however you want to. If you want me to address that,
there's one I would like to. I think could progress. So okay. So KJ's asking about the no real Scotsman fallacy, and he's just saying this is where Christians inevitably go. We're always moving the goalposts, and I think a fruitful area of discussion, trying to make progress with you, Tavo, is what are the goalposts, right? So what are the proper goalposts in your view? It seems to me like you're kind of just saying, well, the standard for a true Christian, because clearly you would agree in the Bible recognizes there are false Christians. Beware of them. The Bible expects us to know from the earliest times, and even Jesus warns us to beware of false antichrists and stuff like that, and false people teaching in his name. So would you say, I think you would say that the standard for you is, well, I'm just taking whoever claims to be a Christian, that's the standard. I'm not going to judge whether they're really true or not, but if they claim it, I'm assuming they're a Christian. Whereas I think Phil has something nuanced. So maybe you guys could discuss what is the normative definition of Christian? How do we come about? Because I have my own answer to that kind of thing. So yeah, do you think there's any fruitful ground there to try and adjudicate what the normative definition of Christian is? What is a true Christian? Phil, do you have anything on that?
Yeah, well, first of all, let me introduce this thought process by saying that the no true Scotsman fallacy is frequently and routinely misunderstood. Most people don't really understand what the no true Scotsman fallacy is. What they think it is that if anybody comes up with some kind of criteria for identifying who a true Scotsman is as opposed to who a false Scotsman is, then they are committing the no true Scotsman fallacy, just because they are applying a criteria. And that's not what the no true Scotsman fallacy is, because it is not a fallacy to identify the characteristics of a given group or a given category. So it's not a fallacy to say this is the criteria for establishing whether or not someone is a true Christian. That's not a fallacy at all. The fallacy is for me to arbitrarily come up with criteria that I've simply made up on my own and have applied it to a certain category or certain group of people, and say that if they don't conform to my personal criteria for what counts as a true Scotsman, then they're not a true Scotsman, and that's because they're not a true Scotsman because I say so. That's where the true Scotsman fallacy really lies. And most people have no idea what that distinction even exists. Okay, because if the No True Scotsman in its tabloid form is actually valid, then there could be no such thing as any criteria that could identify anything that belongs to one category and doesn't belong to a category. And then all categorical thinking would break down if that was the case. So that's kind of a way to set the stage. If people want to move the goalposts about what a Christian is, then that's their business. And I don't take those people very seriously, to be real honest with you. I think that we can establish what a Christian is and what Christianity should say based on something objective instead of something subjective. And so, and a lot of people would say, well, it's impossible to come up with an objective criteria for what counts as a true Christian. And that's another dispute, and that's another argument, and that might have to be settled. That might be prior to the current discussion. I don't know. But if the current discussion, even if the current discussion is posterior to that issue, it still doesn't mean that there's no such thing as a valid criteria for what counts as a person who is a true Christian and is reflecting the actual essence of what Christianity is in the world. And I think that people do exhibit what Christianity really is in a way that's meaningful and in a way that can be persuasive if people will observe it and examine it in a fair way. So that's kind of my general attitude toward the No True Scotsman issue. And Tavo, I'd like to hear what you would have to say about it.
And just before Tavo, I bring you in, because there was a question for you related to this, Phil. And what would you say are, at least partially, how do we tell what a normative Christian is? Do you have an answer for any specifics on that?
I think a Christian is a believer and follower of Christ. And when I say a believer in Christ, Christ came and he gave us a gospel. And his claims are, I am the Son of God. I have come to you in human form to communicate with you, and I have come to you to solve your problem, to solve a problem that is keeping you from having eternal life. And so if you believe in my gospel, and if you believe in my atoning sacrifice, then your sins will be forgiven, your moral guilt problem will be solved, and you will be given new life. You will be given eternal life. And so a true Christian is someone who believes that Jesus Christ was who he claimed to be, and who believes in him and places his faith in him as his savior and his deliverer of eternal life to that person. Now, the moral implications of that are important, but I'm going to go out on a limb and I'm going to say they are secondary, because Jesus did not come to fix us morally. He came to give us new life. And when we are given new life, then we have his righteousness imputed to us. We are now reckoned righteous based on his atoning sacrifice and based on a forensic acquittal in the court of heaven that says we are no longer guilty of our sin. But it doesn't mean we are no longer sinful. And that is the extremely important pressure point in all of this. Because what it means is that after I become a Christian, I have had Christ's righteousness imputed to me, and therefore I am not guilty in the eyes of God. But I still have a responsibility to live my life in conformity to that righteousness that I've been given. I need to live up to that standard, and I don't always live up to that standard. Sometimes I fail. And if I fail, no one has the right to say Christianity is false. But they do have a right to say, I don't believe it because you're not modeling that that faith in a way that is authentic and in a way that is convincing for me personally. So that's what, that's what I think a true Christian is, and I think that is in conformity with the teachings of the New Testament. So,
all right, yeah, Tavo, over to you. What is this normative understanding of Christian that you're using to judge Christianity by? Because obviously, all five of your arguments appeal to various statistics about what Christians on aggregate are doing, and why aren't you committing this? How do you address the no real Scotsman fallacy?
Well, so first of all, we are using this no real Scotsman fallacy a little bit liberally, and it's not quite definitionally correct, and it's a little out of context. But I still think there are a lot of definitional problems that we have. First of all, a lot of what Phil says is very rhetorically persuasive and does make a lot of interesting theological points. There are two big problems with it that I see. The first problem is well, let me address. There's three problems really. Let me address an overall kind of presumption of the arguments that he's making. So, and that big issue is that these are definitions that we still are that are being advanced in a way that's very murky. Like, for example, in the prior statement that he said the central teaching of Jesus is this. So if you're missing the central teaching, that's really the important one. I would argue that's based on his definition of what is central, right? I would argue that Jesus himself says what's central. Love the Lord thy God with all your heart, all your mind, and all your soul. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. To me, that is the central thing. But I could see other people disagreeing with me on that. So then we're again lost without a rudder. We have no definition to steer our way forward in the argument. I think the other criteria that was offered earlier is, are these people really theologically inspired? Is the inspiration of God with them? Well, the problem with that is, again, we don't have any clear definition. It becomes very murky. Who gets to define what is true theological inspiration and what isn't? Now, there's another problem here which we haven't addressed yet adequately enough, I don't think. And that problem is that this directly contradicts the scriptural resources that are relevant, right? You will know people by their fruits, right? So if somebody doesn't have the fruits, that means we should recognize them as being a flawed person, that whatever theology they're advocating is flawed. So now, if I were making this argument myself, the thing that I would pursue is I would say, well, there's two arguments that are sociological, that are empirical, that are statistical, that argue in Phil's points, which we haven't gotten into. One of those arguments, which is flawed, but one of those arguments is the fact that Christians do participate higher in volunteerism and charitable efforts. That's volunteerism to secular causes and charitable donations to secular causes as well. So I'm not counting donations that people give to their own church organizations. Outside of that, if you look at volunteerism and philanthropy, Christians do still score more highly in sociological statistical measures. So that's one argument that I would have. The other argument that I would have is, again, an argument from some of the statistical meta-analysis, which I cited, which is that people who are engaged in religious organizations tend to be healthier. They tend to have, lower morbidity, even lower mortality. Now, that's a really shocking thing to say, but it is borne out in the statistics. Hummer et al. Did a study in 1999 where they showed that, you have an average 7-year higher life expectancy if you participate in religious organizations throughout your life. And this is based on a multifactorial analysis. Those are the arguments that I'd be making to contradict the arguments that I've made in this video. Now, I do want to just briefly say that there's a lot of conversation happening in the chat, which I'd like to just again reference. I hope people will go check out my channel. I hope that you'll check out the CTF argument. And the reason why I'm bringing that up is, and this diverges from the question that Kajik is asking, but I hope that's okay. But I wanted to address a few statements in the chat that are happening around there's so many religions, we don't have an entire lifetime to study each and every religion. I just want to say briefly, that's what my CTF argument is about. It basically looks at quantitative parameters between different religious practices and says which religion is the most based on quantitative evidence and based on quantitative questions that we can ask of each religion. Now, that was done after my own personal, I was diagnosed with terminal leukemia, that I got better. And after that time period, I was still an atheist for a long time, and maybe I was agnostic for about a year right before I kind of came to faith. But during my atheist time, I read the Guru Granth Sahib of Sikhism. Fantastic book. I recommend people check it out. The Kitab-i-Aqdas of Baha'i Faith. Again, great book. I read most of the Pali Canon. Not most of it, but I read big chunks of the Pali Canon. I read the Bhagavad Gita. I read a lot of other. I reread the Quran. I read the Book of Mormon. So that the byproduct of that is the CTF argument, which seeks to circumvent that need to read all of those books by looking at quantitative parameters instead. So I hope people check that out because it's relevant to the chat. Now, I know that doesn't answer KJEC's argument directly, but I thought I would just briefly mention that because I'm arguing a very contrarian viewpoint from what I would normally say in this conversation. So I hope people will check out my channel and the resources that I've put up around some of those arguments.
Okay, I would. You said a couple things in a row there, and I would like to return to this idea of whether or not people are defining the central teachings of Jesus or the essential message of Jesus arbitrarily, and then secondly, I want to revisit what you said about fruits. You said that you will know them by their fruits. You will know good people and people who are authentic in their faith by their fruits, and you'll know that bad people, bad fruits are gonna give you the opportunity to know that someone is a bad fruit, is a bad seed or whatever. But I want to focus on what did you say about someone who is not producing good fruit? What does that say about their theology, or what does that say about the spiritual systematic that they subscribe to?
Well, here's the relevant quotation. I think it's from Matthew 7. Every good tree bears good fruit, but the bad tree bears bad fruits. Thus you will recognize them by their fruits.
Okay.
Yeah. So to me, and it also shows up in obviously in Galatians.
Yeah, I get that. But what I'm sorry to interrupt.
Test the spirits to see whether they are from God.
Okay.
Yeah, that suggests that there's spiritual inspiration that can happen that's from God, and there's spiritual inspiration that can happen that's not from God. And then that litmus test is the good fruits.
Okay, so are you saying that if someone bears bad fruit, then that means that God is not inspiring them, or that God is not behind the overall faith commitment that they subscribe to? Because what you're talking about is testing spirits. He says you will know them by their fruit. It doesn't say you will know the gospel by their fruit. It says you will know them by their fruit. You'll know whether or not they are conforming to the essential agenda of the gospel itself and of Christianity itself. All you're doing is you're exposing frauds. You're not exposing the nature of the original.
But these people wouldn't contend by their own definition that they're fraudulent. You're defining them as frauds. You're saying these people aren't the true Christians.
No, I'm not defining them as frauds. Christ is defining them as frauds. The Bible is defining them as frauds. The Bible is saying these people are bearing bad fruit, and so they are frauds because they're bearing bad fruit. What is bad fruit? Bad fruit is nonconformity to the principles of Christianity, nonconformity to the principles of the gospel that they are articulating.
They would argue that they are conforming to the Bible. They would say, no, we are being very biblical here. Creflo Dollar, if he were here in this conversation, would say, I am very biblically rooted. I am very biblical. I'm adhering to the gospel. Yeah. I am right in line with the gospels.
Yeah, but whether or not they are actually in line with the gospel does not depend on whether they say so. It depends on whether or not you can make an argument that they really are conforming to the gospel. And so this whole line of questioning about bearing fruit it's all posterior to the original, to a deeper issue. And the deeper issue is, how do we know whether someone's fruit is in alignment with what true Christianity teaches? And we can't know that just because they say so. There has to be a standard, an objective standard that can actually adjudicate between whether or not whether they're bearing good fruit or bearing bad fruit, whether their claim that they are bearing fruit based on what authentic Christianity really teaches, or whether they're not. And so, just because somebody says like Creflo Dollar or whatever, I can't think of the right pronunciation of his name, but just because he says I'm following the gospel and he's not, doesn't mean that now we can adjudicate the gospel based on his behavior, based on his agenda, because he may have a corrupt agenda and he might be convinced that he is following the authentic gospel of Christ.
So
but
then what's
that doesn't mean he is.
Then what's the objective standard?
The objective standard is a sound, defensible, analytic understanding of what the gospel teaches, what the content of the gospel is. And it is possible to adjudicate.
You're saying the Creflo Dollar by his own definition doesn't meet that? Like, I feel like he would say, no, I'm objectively meeting the gospel. I'm got a sound understanding, and I'm meeting it.
And I'm saying that what counts as someone objectively meeting the standard is not the fact that they claim that they are objectively meeting the standard. That's not where the criteria lies. The criteria lies in whether they really are objectively meeting that standard. And if it's impossible to identify whether or not someone is objectively conforming to the substance of the gospel, then we have nothing. Then there's no conversation to be had. There is no gospel at that point, because there's no objective way to conduct a sound, rational analysis of the content of the gospel and then compare that to whatever teaching any given disciple might be presenting.
Can I, Tavo? So I'm going to let you address this, but this is a good opportunity just to bring this in. So for example, one of the comments from Harry Stark, hey Harry, he's saying emotionalism does not falsify the facts or the historicity. And to Phil's point here, I would like you to kind of respond, like, you yourself, in presenting your 5 objections, you actually contrasted the Bible's teachings on these 5 matters, right? For example, we are stewards of the earth. The Bible says we're to care for animals. The Bible teaches against self-aggrandizing things and stuff like that. So even you, aren't you even recognizing, well, if the Bible's the standard, it's clearly objectively teaching against these 5 bad things that the others are doing that I don't like. So therefore, isn't that an objective standard for you to say, yeah, actually, I can't judge Christianity by this. I should be judging it by the Bible. And the Bible tells me what I want to hear on these 5 issues. What's your take on that?
And you mean that question for me, right? I think you said Phil.
Yeah. Because it's related to Harry Stark. Forget about the emotional reaction to how the fruits of people falsely claiming to represent Christ. The fruits of the Bible, in terms of the 5 teachings, it's supporting what you want to hear there. So why aren't you using the Bible as your objective standard?
Yeah, and I think if I were arguing the counterpoint to my opening statement, Dale, that's one of the arguments that I would make. So I don't want to say it doesn't completely lack persuasiveness to me. I think it's a good point to bring up. I think if I were, again, debating the perspective that I'm in, I would say Christians don't even meet this standard in the Bible. So that falsifies Christianity first. And then second, I would say this proves one of the underlying problems of the whole argument, which is that we lack objective standards, right? Creflo Dollar would say, I'm here, I'm being scriptural. Everything I'm saying is based on the scriptural resources, it's based on the New Testament, it's based on the Old Testament. And Phil could say, well, you're not meeting these other things in the Old Testament that I think are more important. And my problem with that is Phil keeps saying, let's have an objective standard. We need an objective metric, and we don't have one. So that would be the response to that thing, that if you brought that up, Dale. Now, I do want to address, could you put Mr. Stark's, how is it, Harry Stark? Is that his name? Feel free to put it back on the screen.
I unstarted, but he was just saying, like, emotionalism doesn't take away from the objective facts. He said of historicity, but I was relating it to, what the Bible's teachings are as the standard kind of thing. So,
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's a persuasive argument too, and that's maybe another counterpoint that I think is a valid counterpoint to my opening statement. But I think there are retorts to that. The first retort that I would say is that this isn't about emotionalism. This is about a moral indictment, right? I think anyone
Right.
can look at the things that I said and say, fundamentally, objectively, these at least feel like they're bad things, right? Even if you're an ethical emotivist, you could look at this stuff and say, no, this feels like this is wrong stuff that the Christians are doing.
Objectively, they feel.
No, I mean, well, I mean, I think objectively there's a standard that you could appeal to, but I don't want to get into the whole can morality ever be objective, because then we'll be down that rabbit hole for the rest of the
You
conversation.
know, but what I'm saying is that you're saying this is not about emotionalism, but then you turn around and say, well,
absolutely,
this problem makes it feel like they're not, and feel is
well,
emotionalism.
I mean, this is how an emotional the emotive objective ethicist would retort, would frame this, right? So the problem, I don't want to go into like, can objective morality ever exist? Can it never exist? Because I feel like that's a whole long philosophical wormhole that, right? That's another point that maybe somebody could make to my opening statement, saying you're appealing to ethics, but ethics can't exist without Christianity.
Yeah.
I think that's a reasonable conversation, but that would take us in a very different direction.
The problem is, here's the central problem that I see. You're saying that it's arbitrary for me to define what the objective standards are for what counts as Christian behavior and counts as Christian content and so on. And that somebody else might disagree with that objective standard, or they might not call it objective. They might say, well, no, this is the objective standard, Phil. You don't have the right standard. So you're saying that we can't appeal to some objective content or standard in the Bible, but on the other hand, you're appealing to a whole bunch of failures of Christians to conform to the standards of the Bible. And so you're actually saying that you have an objective standard of what the Bible teaches, and that Christians don't conform to it. So your entire objection relies on the very thing that you're denying at this point.
No, it doesn't, and let me explain why. But let me address quickly the second point that I wanted to make about the argument that Harry Stark put up on the screen, which does this contradict the historicity? Well, number one, I think it contradicts the relevant scriptural citations. But again, I would refer people to my own channel, because I address a lot of historical considerations on my channel, and it sounds like Mr. Stark has a more Christian enthusiastic perspective. I think you'll at least be interested by some of these historical insights that I have. Now, all right, now let's get back to your point, which is that I'm using the Bible as my objective ethical anchor. Well, I think the arguments still stand without that being the evaluative criteria. And the way they stand is, I would argue that I don't need to prove an objective criteria, an objective ethical criteria, to make those arguments that those 5 things are moral indictments. I can just say that you would have to prove to me that those are not good standards. Ethical treatment towards animals, usury, exploitation of other people, fleecing the blue collar, like these are all things that seem to me like they're morally repugnant by any definition of morality. So the fact that Christians aren't doing these things well, they're being complicit, they're being and by the way, if you're just joining the conversation, I hope you'll go back to that opening statement, because I think it makes some of these points more eloquently than I'm making them right now. But I understand the objection. The objection is, I'm appealing to a biblical ethical standard. I think that's a reasonable objection. The way I would argue against that is, I would say the indictment is that Christians aren't even meeting their own standards. But the other indictment to this is that I think it's easy to make the case that all 5 of these things are objectively flawed by any moral standard. Right? So even if you get rid of the biblical quotations that the Christian behavior is supposed to be based on, right? That it's still a valid argument, because my argument is a broad moral indictment. The third thing I would say is, then we get into the problem of the biblical resources that are relevant to all 5 moral indictments being inappropriately subjective. Because I bet you, if I had a conversation with, let's say I had a conversation with people about the prosperity gospel, they are going to cite scriptural quotations that say, no, it's totally justified to cite this prosperity gospel. It's totally justified for me to fleece people because of all these biblical quotations that I have in my armamentarium. And I would say that brings us back to the same problem that we've had in this conversation, which is, does the Bible really provide an ethical, objective moral standard? And if it doesn't, then that independently is an indictment.
Okay. Well, I agree with that last statement, that if the Bible does not present a coherent ethical standard, then yes, that does indict the Bible. It does indict its credibility. So, but you're still appealing to a rational and objective and definitive understanding of certain moral principles, whether they are taught in the Bible or not. But your objection against Christians is they're not following their own standard. They're not following standards that they know should be there because the Bible teaches them. And even if the Bible didn't teach them, they're still objective moral standards that they are violating, and therefore they have surrendered their credibility, and they've surrendered the credibility of Christianity. And again, you're still assuming that you have an objective understanding of those moral principles, and that Christians should have an objective understanding of those moral principles because the Bible teaches those Christians what those moral principles are. Because you cited various Bible verses about treating animals ethically and so on, and being good stewards of the environment, whatever that happens to be. And so you can't escape the fact that you are using the Bible in a way where you're treating it as though it's an objective standard, and that your understanding of the Bible is valid. Because if your understanding of the Bible is not valid, then your critique of the behavior of Christians is not valid either. Well, so but you can't have it both ways.
But here's the problem, because I do want to be able to move on from this part of the conversation. But here's the problem: is you're saying that that's the linchpin of the argument, and it's actually not. In other words, what I'm saying is my 5 moral indictments still stand, even if you take away the Bible resources as the linchpin of the argument. Now, if your argument is instead you don't have any objective moral framework, and therefore, all 5 moral indictments are flawed because this is just, you're just subjective without a Bible or without a set of moral values, I think I would just say, well, okay, fine, let me grant that, but I would say these 5 things all seem like they're morally repugnant by anyone's moral standard. But I don't personally get into can morality ever be objective argument, because I just think it's such a huge rabbit hole. But I think, again, even if you take away all those Bible quotations, all my moral indictments stand as indictments of morality. Now, here's the important thing, though. The biggest Bible statement that I would keep in there is that the religious identification of God with a populace can be revoked. And that's according to 1 Samuel. So the scriptural resources suggest that if God's people lose their favor with God for transgressing morality in a way that's too egregious, right? Then and that's an argument in and of itself for non-identification with Christianity. And I think that's a little more ironclad. But I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole, Dale. So if you want us to move on, I'm happy to do that or take more questions.
Well, I had something that I thought was going to be helpful, but now I'm going to have to try and remember it because you guys went on a whole host of stuff. So
sorry, I know. Yeah, that's...
So just to go back to what I was thinking, because again, this is about trying to convince you, Tavo. So so let's start with, okay, the biblical data. I'm saying there's an objective interpretation to it, and you point out now that people disagree with it, but I'm just I don't care about people disagreeing or not. You personally, Tavo, having read, you presented as part of your case these Bible verses, and you said the Bible supports Christians ought to be protecting the environment. They ought to not get into debt and stuff like that. And so I'm just curious, for you personally, would you affirm that, to the best of your knowledge, you think the correct interpretation of the Bible is in accordance with the 5 things, moral objections that you had?
Yeah, I mean, Dale, I'm playing devil's advocate a little bit in this debate. So you're outside of the context of this debate. Do I think that there's objective basis for these things, and are these things good ideas? I would argue that even though I'm playing sort of devil's advocate in this debate, that outside of this debate, yeah, I think there's probably enough. Now, I'm not a theological scholar, so I could see somebody saying, no, the theology is actually that man can't abuse the environment, but I think I'd be pretty surprised by that. So my gestalt, I would say, is that all 5 of the moral indictments would stand on a biblical basis. That's outside of the context of this argument, though. So in other words, I still think that as presenting the argument from this stance, that doesn't invalidate the argument itself. But I am playing devil's advocate a little bit, so your point is well taken.
Okay, so pretending, so then great. So if you personally, on the basis of the evidence that you know, are prepared to go, the Bible teaches me on these 5 issues. It teaches me that Christians ought to behave in the way that I like, so that the Bible's not objectionable in terms of the doctrines it's teaching on these 5 issues. Next step. But then you're saying, if I understand, you're saying, yeah, but even Christians in the Bible violate these things. They sin, they mess up at least once, kind of thing, in their lives, and they don't follow this. So therefore, they're not upholding the biblical stuff. Like, is it you expect? Do you think that the Bible teaches every Christian has to uphold the biblical doctrines perfectly, otherwise they're not exhibiting the fruits of the Spirit? Like, what? That's where I'm getting confused, and I would like some clarification. Like, where does the fact that Paul admits, hey, sometimes I sin, I struggle in the flesh, how does that equate to, okay, well, therefore he's not a Christian, and stuff like that?
That's a really hard question. I think there has to be intention and there has to be effort, right? When I look at these 5 moral indictments, I don't see any signs of intention. I don't see any signs of effort. I see at least complicit, participation. And then in many cases, I see antagonistically working against these moral arguments. I'm shocked that I can't. I mean, I would encourage people to do their own research, to do Google searches, but I cannot find many churches that argue like a statement against usury. How about one statement from any Christian organization that says there is too much usury? We are causing a society of exploitation because we've departed from this biblical value system. Now that's really shocking to me, particularly because this is not like a remote thing. I would say in the 1500s to the 1980s, there has been a progressive, marginal, incremental relaxation of biblically based legislation against usury, right? And yet, at none of those time points was there ever like a really big church pushback that said, in the 1980s, they weakened a lot of the anti-usury laws. Now, before anyone says that, well, you're just basing this, again, this is outside of the context of this debate, outside of the context of this argument. I would say that why didn't any church stand up and say this? So this is not about like saying, yeah, we're Christian, we're going to mess up. I'm going to go to church. I'm going to, have an affair and be really, really, contrite about it and be very apologetical afterwards. Yeah, you can mess up, and that's not what I'm, what I'm judging people for is like this kind of unabashed, like, yeah, I'm here. I've got millions of dollars that I'm lining my pockets. I'm taking those millions of dollars from the blue collar class, and I'm doing it proudly, unabashedly, and based on a very strong scriptural basis. I think when you get to that level, you're not outside. You're way outside of like Paul saying, "Yes, I'm a sinner sometimes." You're way outside of, and let me preface this all by saying, I know a lot of Christians who are really, really wonderful people. Some of the best people I know, probably better people than I am. And the real reason here, just to get back to Mr. Stark's comment, is there emotionalism here? There is. I'll say I was really heartbroken when the pastor of a church that I was going to, and I don't bring any of my ideas up at the church. I just go there, I say hi to people, and I'm happy to get engaged. And somebody identified me as Tavo, right? And they looked at my videos, and they said, this video is really bad. You're going to go to hell. And the pastor said, yeah, you know what? You should take down this video. I'm not going to deny that was really heartbreaking. Emotionally, that was a devastating moment,
Okay, well, let me jump in here real quick, because there are 3 things that I think we need to address. One of them is the last thing you said about emotionalism. Emotionalism is not having an emotional reaction to something. That's not emotionalism. Emotionalism is, I feel a certain way, therefore I'm going to make various definitive propositional conclusions based on my feelings. That's what emotionalism is. And so I don't think that you're guilty of emotionalism at all, Tavo, simply because you have an emotional reaction to things. I think if you didn't have these emotional reactions, then I would be worried about you. So I think that your emotionalism, if you want to use that word, I think that your emotionalism, Tavo, is healthy, because you should be repulsed. You should be outraged by people who are just glaringly opposing certain principles that exist in a Bible that they claim to live by. So I mean, I am right there in your corner with you on that, on that subject. But the other two problems still exist. They haven't been dismissed and they haven't been solved. You're still assuming that your understanding of the opposition to usury in the Bible is sound and is accurate. You're still assuming that you have a valid, sound understanding, objective understanding that the Bible teaches against usury, and therefore people who are promoting usury are violating biblical principles. So you haven't escaped this basic problem that you are saying that people don't have an objective understanding, or that it's not possible to have an objective understanding of what the Bible teaches. Yet you do have an objective understanding of what the Bible teaches, because you have a definite definite accusation against people who are violating a biblical principle based on the way you understand it.
Let me correct you there, because I may have misspoken a little bit, and I think I expressed myself in a way that was not entirely elegant. But my point of that subpoint is that in addition to that, if you throw away all the biblical resources, you still have a practice which is morally repugnant by any definition. And that would be my ethical standard that I would appeal to. So in other words, I think the argument has persuasiveness independent of the biblical resources. You see what I'm saying there? So in other words, an understanding of what's objective or what's moral or what's based on the Bible is not necessarily, I would agree with you. Outside of the confines of this debate, I feel like my understanding of usury as an objective moral principle from the Bible is pretty accurate. But within the confines of this debate, I think the argument still holds. And the reason why it still holds is because I would argue that by any objective ethical standard at all, usury potentiates exploitation of other people. And we live in a society where that exploitation is happening on a massive level. So that's the indictment. So even if you say, well, take away the biblical underpinning, the indictment still works because it's a moral indictment.
Yeah, now, but the indictment still doesn't work. And the reason that it doesn't work is that because you're still appealing to an objective moral standard. And before you can do that, you have to establish that there is an objective moral standard, that it is real, and that it is binding on human beings. If you can't establish that, then your entire argument falls apart. Because if there is no objective moral standard that you're appealing to, then you can't appeal to an objective moral standard.
Okay, all right. So now that's a different argument. You're saying you don't have any objective morality without the Bible. That's the argument.
No. It's not what I said. Not what I said.
Okay, all right. So what if I just say that by any ethical standard, exploitation of others is morally repugnant? Wouldn't that salvage the argument?
No, because you have to establish that there's even such a thing as an objective ethical standard. Okay. And I'm not saying that you don't have one without the Bible. I'm saying that you have to have one based on something, even if it's not based on the Bible. An objective ethical standard has to be based on something. It has to be grounded somewhere. If it's not grounded somewhere, then you can't appeal to it in order to make an argument.
Well, okay, but now let me clarify here that I don't want to go down that rabbit hole of like, can objective ethics exist? We could go down that rabbit hole. Well, here's why I don't think I need to, right? Because I think you can put any number of questions in front of a contention that Christianity is morally flawed, right? One question you could put in front of that question is, can you prove morality without the Bible, without referencing some objective ethical standard, right? Another question you could put in front of that is any knowledge noble? Now, I argue the same thing when I advocate for my CTF argument, which is a comparative theological framework for arguing which theology is the most valid, right? Because people often come to that argument and say, well, you haven't proved that any theistic perspective is valid at all, right? That's the most common objection that I get to that argument. And the question I always say is, you could put any number of questions in front of my argument. For instance, anytime I make an argument about Jesus anywhere on my channel, there's a bunch of mythicists that will come into the comment section and say, wait, you haven't proven the historicity of Jesus. And my challenge to them is always, let's start with the counterfactual that Jesus exists, even if you just accept it only as a counterfactual, and then let's look at this argument. So I would suggest that it's more productive to do that in this conversation, because otherwise we're going to be going down this rabbit hole of like, can moral objectivism exist? Can you ever have objective morality? Which is a whole different philosophical debate. So I would say, let's start with the assumption that you can have objective morality in order for my contentions to have persuasiveness and to have a meaningful conversation here from this point on. Now, I will take it as a valid criticism that I haven't yet proven that objective ethics can exist. I'm okay with that, as long, because I just don't want to go into that whole rabbit hole of like, can you ever have objective versus subjective morality? I've gone down that rabbit hole. I don't think it's super productive, and it would result in a really long tangent of this conversation. So my point is, assuming that objective morality exists, these are moral indictments of Christianity. If your argument is you're putting an assumption out there without justifying it, I would say I accept that. That's a reasonable argument, but in the interest of just kind of moving forward and having a more productive discussion, let's just move on from that point. But I accept that as an indictment. Okay. That's a reasonable thing to say, is I have to prove objective morality first to say that something is morally repugnant. I think that's what you're claiming. I haven't done that. I think that's a reasonable contention. My refutation, again, for purposes of this argument, would be, by any standard, exploiting other people, torturing animals are morally repugnant. But again, we're probably not going to make much headway. We'll just keep going backward about whether or not we need to bring up the conversation about moral relativism, which is a long conversation.
I just think two things. I just think that you're dismissing the seriousness of that problem. You're saying this is just not a problem for me. I'm just going to keep moving forward, and I'm just going to assume that there's enough objective morality out there that my objections are valid, and I just don't think you can move forward with your argument that way. I think that actually by itself, it defeats your entire argument, because it relies on the fact that there is some kind of objective morality out there that Christianity is violating. And so if you want to move on,
to prove my argument, I have to prove that objective morality can exist.
Well, if objective morality does not exist, then your argument is invalid. That's the point that I'm making. So if you want to
critique and say that my argument exists only within the counterfactual situation that moral objectivity can exist.
Well, yeah, and that's the point. That's the very point that I'm making.
Yeah, you're making a critique of the argument. It's not a refutation. You're just saying there's another contention, another discussion that belongs in front of my argument. I'm willing to sort of just say okay to that, just in the interest of moving on. I understand.
What I'm saying is that you have an undercutting defeater to your argument that you're not addressing. That's the problem.
And I'm not addressing it for a specific reason, because I want to have a moral discussion about a productive moral discussion about the indictments of Christianity that I have.
Okay.
Right.
Which you can't have.
Well, I know, but I think whenever you're dealing with any philosophical topic, there's any number of questions that you can put in front of any contention, any argument, right? Like I have this conversation on my channel all the time with like mythicists, because I know I'm not going to convince any of them that Jesus was a real historical person. So I always say, can you take this argument? Can you take this set of contentions from the standpoint that Jesus was a historical person, right? So that's what I'm saying we should do here. In order to have a productive conversation, let's start with the assumption, however flawed it might be by your definition, that there is objective morality, just so that we can move forward with the conversation.
Okay, and that's fine. I don't have a problem with that necessarily, other than the fact that if you haven't established that basis, then what we're doing is we're moving forward on thin air. We're moving forward on something that doesn't have a foundation. We're expecting a rocket that has no
Well,
engines to take us to the moon.
Can we prove that
You know.
anything is knowable? Can we prove that knowledge exists? Can we prove that the discussion is happening? I mean,
Yeah,
that's the problem.
exactly.
I have. You have to throw a bunch of questions in front of the contention, and then it turns into like a really long
And-
philosophical
And
rabbit hole, rather than the
that's
discussion of the moral indictment of Christianity.
That's right. That you cannot have a discussion of the moral indictments of Christianity until you establish various foundations first. If those foundations are not established, then the entire discussion is meaningless. But let's assume that we want to move forward. My second the second problem that I want to bring up is the problem that I brought up originally, and that is that the only thing that you have accomplished is that Christians behave badly. You have not addressed the validity or the truth or the credibility of Christianity itself at all. You have only established that Christians don't live consistently with Christianity, which we all agree with. And so your entire argument is an extremely sophisticated array of propositions about how Christians behave, that there are Christians who intentionally violate ethical standards. And so therefore, you're concluding that Christianity has no credibility because of the fact that Christians are brazenly defying moral principles. That says nothing about Christianity.
I think I have it two ways, but I want to give it back to Dale for a second to rein in the conversation.
Yeah, I've been trying to get it.
Go ahead,
I do have, I think, an appropriate question from or comment from the audience here. So okay, basically, again, Tavo, I was trying to establish. I think you are maybe possibly giving a little bit more than just, Christians behave badly. Let me see if this is your standard, right? Because you are willing to agree, for the sake of argument, that you think that you agree with me that the Bible teaches the correct standard on these 5 issues. But then you're impugning Christianity apart from the Bible, because the Bible is not equated with Christianity. What you're equating Christianity and judging on is the fact that the behavior of true Christians as a group. And I think the way you're saying this is that on these 5 issues, look, the Bible clearly teaches that there would be true Christians out there, at least some group, 5 or more, or something like that, at the very least, right? 500, 5,000, whatever it is. Of the 2 billion, at least some subset is there. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think what you're saying is, when it comes to these 5 issues, if there are true Christians in the world, I would expect at least some of them to be advancing these biblical things. There would be a group of Christian activists against usury, and there's not. There would be a group of Christian activists against animal welfare, and again, according to you, and there's not. In the same way, and here's where another YouTube channel's comment comes in. He's saying it's kind of like James Talrico's conversation with Ezra Klein, where it says the church spends too much time on 2 issues, abortion and homosexuality. And because of that, they're prioritizing and they're activists on certain issues, but they're not activists on all issues. So that's where you're impugning Christianity, that we would expect there to be Christian activists against usury, and there's not. And on these 5 issues, and there's not. Number one, am I correct? Is that how you are impugning Christianity there? Or have I got that wrong?
Again, I think there's 3 possible, there may be 4 possible outcomes of this conversation that I think are a synthesis. One is that, again, if there's, not to get back to the debate about moral relativism and subjectivity, but I think there is a degree to which anyone from the outside would look at Christianity, the agenda of Christianity, and say, this behavior is morally repugnant, right? Number 2, even if I agree that if your question is, is anyone doing this, then I would say the problem isn't the intentional transgression of these moral principles. intentional transgression of the Bible. The problem is that there's no agreement on these moral principles based on the interpretation that these Christians have of the moral principles. So now I don't want to go too far down that, because I feel like you're shaking your head. So am I misinterpreting the question?
Where does that take you?
Well, let's go to. Let me get. It was Dale shaking his head, because go ahead, Dale. I don't want to get. Go. Did I sort of? Does that sort of answer the question? Or am I misinterpreting the question?
Well, no. So I wanted to make sure I was understanding what the basis of your indictment of Christianity proper is.
Well, I think, first of all, it's a case towards non-identification with Christianity, right? There's definitional drift on what Christianity is. That itself makes a case for Christianity, right?
On the part of Christians.
Non-identification with Christianity, right? And I just want to highlight something that you said at the beginning of your comment, Dale, like maybe there's 5 Christians in the world. I think one of my favorite quotes about Christianity comes from Friedrich Nietzsche, who did, he's obviously a very atheistic proponent, but he did actually express admiration for the teachings of Jesus in isolation. One of my favorite quotes from Nietzsche is, "There was really only ever one Christian, and that person died on the cross."
Okay.
I just think it's an interesting side.
I mean, that carries a lot of rhetorical weight, but there isn't a whole lot of logical coherence to it, because there was more than one Christian. We can establish that basically from history. But the other objection that there's nobody out there who is somehow organized against the concept of usury, or who are organized against the abuse of our environment, that's just simply false. It is simply not true. There are Christian organizations that don't believe in usury and that have said so.
Are there Christian organizations that argue against usury, that are trying to fix the legislative problems with our predatory?
Well, whether they're involved in trying to legislate the problem away or not does. Here's the point, Tavo. The point is that the idea that there is no organized objection to these moral infractions and these problematic moral areas is simply not factual. There are Christian denominations and there are churches. There are various churches that have an anti-usury posture, and they make that a part of their belief statement. Now, whether or not they're out there engaged and involved in political activism or not is beside the point. The point is that they have taken a stand against this. There are lots of Christian organizations, and there are even Christian denominations that preach against the abuse of the environment. They simply exist, and for you to say that they don't exist, I think is disingenuous. I don't think that's factual at all. Now, the fact that they are in the minority doesn't mean that they. Oh, I can't name them off the top of my head, but it wouldn't take long. It wouldn't take long for me to come up with some examples. I could sit down and I could Google the question, and I could come up with Christian organizations that are environmentally conscious. I just think this.
Well, at best, I would say the problem is then that makes those organizations complicit by not. You're saying they acknowledge that this is a problem, they're not doing anything about it.
Well, but the fact that they're not doing anything about it doesn't say anything about Christianity. It only says something about Christians, and that's where I think the fundamental flaw here is.
Well, then at the very least, I would argue the banner is being held by the wrong people. At the very least.
Okay, sure, fine. I agree. There are a lot of bad Christians out there, and they're giving good Christians a bad name. That's absolutely true.
Then why not say we need a different name? Why not say we need to call ourselves the way? We shouldn't identify as Christians. We should call ourselves Jesusists.
I agree. I think people who have departed from the essence of biblical Christianity should not call themselves Christians. I agree with that. But again, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't say anything about the validity of Christianity. It only says that there's an army of bad Christians out there. They're giving Christianity a bad name, and they're failing in the sociological argument for
And then the problem
Christianity.
becomes, what defines a bad Christian? Creflo Dollar would say, I'm a great Christian. He would say, I'm the best Christian in the world.
Well, we've already covered that ground. If we say that there's no objective criteria for what defines a Christian, then your entire objection against Christianity fails. Because if there's no objective identification of what a Christian is, then you can't say that those Christians are not following Christianity, because you can't define Christianity in the first place.
That they're being morally repugnant.
Yeah, but that's a different question. That's a different issue. The fact that they're being morally repugnant still doesn't address whether Christianity is true or false, or whether it's credible or not credible.
I would say it at least strongly addresses the credibility question.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Well, it addresses the credibility question in the eyes of people, in the eyes of individuals. It doesn't address the credibility question in an objective sense. It doesn't say Christianity is not credible. It just says that Christianity is not credible in the eyes of the world. And I think that that's true in some cases. In some cases it's valid, in some cases it's not valid. There are people who don't think Christianity is credible, and they're wrong. And there are people who don't think Christianity is credible on the basis of the bad behavior of Christians, and they're right. So all of those things can be held in tension, and all of those things can be held to be true without contradiction. But the bottom line is that does not tell us whether or not Christianity is true or false. It only tells us that Christians don't live consistently with their faith.
All right. So I want to, first of all, Tavo, you were asking someone environmentalism, reasons to believe with Hugh Ross. And I put a link in the chat so you can watch his show on Unbelievable. He actually has a plan to solve the issue, and it was a quite brilliant one. I'm surprised secular scientists aren't paying attention to it, but he has a solution to solve climate change kind of thing that's hasn't been thought of by other scientists or
I'll check that out. I have actually a new thing that I'm doing where every Sunday I post my favorite lecture that I found on YouTube. Mm-hmm. So I'll check that out, and if I'll probably post it tomorrow morning if I like it, because yeah,
cool. So here's the thing I think we should turn to, because of the 5 things that you've listed here in terms of your problems, there is one potential one where I think the Bible may actually violate, depending on what you meant. You couched it in terms of homosexuality. There's legalism, which I think you would include just anyone saying the Bible teaches homosexuality is a sin. If you're a practicing homosexual, you will be damned in your sin. And then you contrasted that with human dignity. So I think it is possible even Phil and I would admit that the Bible may not be upholding even your moral principle there. So do you guys want to discuss the issue of homosexuality in that particular one, and whether the Bible and or Christianity upholds a moral teaching on that front?
Well, I would want to address the claim that the Bible does not actually uphold human dignity by prohibiting homosexuality. I think the Bible is upholding human dignity by prohibiting homosexuality, because homosexuality is itself a threat to human dignity if it violates the original ontology of God and how he created human beings. So this idea that the Bible doesn't uphold human dignity with its prohibition against homosexuality is a massive question-begging fallacy at that point.
Isn't your reasoning circular? You're saying the Bible condemns homosexuality, and that's good for human dignity, and the reason why it's good for human dignity is because of the standard in the Bible. That's a circular pathway, isn't it?
No, because that's not my argument. My argument is,
how does it independently uphold human dignity without appealing to the value system in the Bible itself already?
Well, it appeals to the ontology of human beings, and so that's a question that has to precede the current issue, because because if the Bible is true and
Your
God
basis of that,
God created humanity, He created humanity to function in a certain way, and that there are certain practices and behaviors in humanity that actually violate the ontology that God has created from the beginning, then if they violate their ontology and they violate their who they are as human beings based on being created in the image of God, then that practice is going to negate human dignity instead of uphold it. And so that question has to be answered before we can even discuss this issue.
But your standard for you're making a claim there, and the claim you're making is human dignity, and the standard for human dignity, your evaluative criteria, your trustworthiness threshold, is what's in the Bible already. So at best, that's still a circle, isn't it? In other words, can you argue why homosexuality is an affront to human dignity without citing any ethical standard in the Bible?
Probably not.
Okay, all right. Well, then the problem is the argument becomes circular, right? Because you're saying homosexuality is an affront to human dignity. How would we find human dignity? It's based on what's in the Bible, and the Bible says that homosexuality is wrong. Then,
well, I don't know that I could prove that homosexuality is an affront to human dignity outside of the Bible. I'm not sure that I could prove it, but I think there is evidence that homosexuality is an affront to human dignity because the Bible even appeals to natural arguments when it comes to homosexuality, that our natural function as biological life forms is actually heterosexual. That is the way that.
Wait a second. How that's not. You're saying it's natural to be heterosexual. It's unnatural to be homosexual.
Well, I think we can make a case that the way that human beings naturally function, I think that we can make the case that does promote human dignity, and that a violation of it will be an affront to human dignity. But that's a huge.
I'm okay with that, but then you have to make the case that heterosexuality is natural and homosexuality is not natural to make that case?
Yes, I do. And so when you first asked that question, I said probably not, because in this forum, I would not be able to make that case. It would take too long to make that case. So I will admit that I can't make the case here and now that heterosexuality is natural and homosexuality is not natural, based on the evidence of biology and based on the evidence of human relationships and how humans behave, how humans relate to each other. I think we can make that case. I just can't make it at the moment because it would require more than our resources are going to permit. This is just like you were talking earlier about some of the questions that precede the initial, the issues. But the point still stands. Even if I can't make that case at the moment, the point still stands that the idea that homosexuality or that the prohibition of homosexuality is an affront to human dignity is question begging, just as much as it would be question begging me if I were to simply ask you to accept that heterosexuality is natural and homosexuality is not natural. I would be question begging because I can't present that case right now. But you're begging the question.
That homosexuality is natural, though. I'm happy to present that case. There's plenty of biological evidence that homosexuality is perfectly natural.
Well, again, we would have to get into the weeds about that. But don't miss my point. The point is that your statement that the prohibition against homosexuality negates human dignity is question begging. On its face, it's question begging, because you would have to establish a moral principle that says that homosexuality is actually valid and virtuous, and you haven't made that case, just like I haven't made the case that homosexuality is unnatural. To say,
I don't know that I need to prove that homosexuality is virtuous. I think I just need to prove that homosexuality is on equal footing with heterosexuality.
Okay.
I don't think there's any moral precept that says that that would suggest. I mean, if you're saying, well, it's in the Bible, and therefore, I think even the biblical evidence around this is really, really fraught. I don't think it's clear at all. I
Okay,
think
yeah,
there's some biblical resources that you could cite, but there's plenty that you could cite that suggest that no, that's not the way it is.
Yeah, I have gone through that entire issue at length and in depth for years and years. So I'm familiar with all of those arguments. I'm familiar with the biblical data. I'm familiar with the claims that people make about the lack of support for anti-homosexuality in the Bible. But that doesn't really address the original point. The original point is that for you to say that the prohibition of homosexuality is an affront to human dignity is still question begging. At the end of the day, it's question begging because you haven't established that homosexuality and human dignity are in harmony with each other. You haven't established that the prohibition of homosexuality is disharmonious with human dignity. You haven't established that. You're simply assuming it.
I can prove that homosexuality is natural, right? We know that homosexuality happens in the state of nature. We know that many animals have increased rates of homosexuality. We know that population pressures can increase homosexuality. We know that humans, when there's an increased population pressure in human populations and mammals specifically, that increases homosexuality as well. We know that there's biological and epigenetic features that can increase homosexuality. So all these things suggest that it's a naturalistic mechanism. I'm
familiar with all of that. But there's a missing element.
Well, is the obligation isn't the obligation on the people condemning homosexuality? Isn't the obligation on them? Don't they have the burden of proof to show that homosexuality is flawed?
Yes. Well, they do, but you also have the burden of proof to show that the prohibition against homosexuality is an affront to human dignity. Sauce for the goose. So the fundamental problem with what you're saying about how homosexuality is natural is that you can easily equivocate on the definition of the word natural, because there's some things that are natural.
In the state of nature.
There are some things that are natural that we still say are abnormal. If someone is born with spina bifida, then they were born that way. And somebody could make the case, well, it's natural for them to have spina bifida because spina bifida occurs in nature. Therefore, spina bifida is natural. So why should we try to execute some corrective surgery against spina bifida? Because it's natural. It's an affront to human dignity by trying to correct birth defects with surgery, because they're natural. They all occurred in nature, so therefore it's natural. See the problem?
Well, yeah. I think the problem here is that you're taking what's pathological and inflating it with what's natural. I think those are two different things, right? You can have physiologic and pathologic, and that's different than natural versus unnatural, right? In other words, you can have pathological conditions that occur in the state of nature and say these are causing suffering, and if we can mitigate them, we should. And I would argue, well, that's your natural tendency playing out, right? It is natural for humans in the state of nature to try and take care of other humans who are sick.
Okay, well, I can make the case that homosexuality causes suffering as well. And therefore, by your own criteria, you could say that homosexuality is natural.
Who does homosexuality cause suffering for?
It causes unbelievable amounts of medical and health problems. And I can give you some resources. I can give you some resources from researchers who have identified how homosexuality, it destroys people's health and destroys people's lives, and the medical and physiological, the medical. Can I please finish a sentence? Okay, real quick. The medical research points to the fact that there are enormous medical and physiological problems that are associated with homosexuality, intrinsically associated with homosexual behavior and homosexual practice. And I don't remember who the researcher was that I have in mind right now, but there's more than one of them. And what's happening right now is that their research and their findings are censored and are suppressed in the literature. And so we can make a case that homosexuality is harmful and is pathological from a physiological standpoint, just as pathological or just as harmful as birth defects are. In fact, there are some effects of homosexuality that occur medically and physiologically that are worse than some birth defects. So if you want to define natural as whatever occurs in nature, then you have to accept that there's a huge problem here. That just because something occurs in nature does not mean that it shouldn't be corrected, and that it is absolutely normal. See, natural and normal are not the same thing.
Wait a second. I have to argue against the standard that you're upholding here, right? Because you're saying there is some research somewhere that's unpublished that shows that homosexuality is harmful.
I didn't say it was unpublished.
Well, you're saying it's not. You said it's not in the scholarly literature.
It's published. It's published, it's peer reviewed, but it is suppressed. I said it's suppressed. I said it is censored. I didn't say it was unpublished.
Okay, all right. So I apologize. So what is the mechanism whereby homosexuality causes these harms?
Well, I don't want to get into the weeds and get into the details, because I would have to reference that research.
You're making a huge claim here, and now you're saying that to refute this claim, I have to be familiar with this evidence that I've never heard before. That probably I've not heard it because it's suppressed or censored, you would probably argue. And you're saying homosexuality is intrinsically causing these things. And you can't make that claim without making evidence, or at least you have to say, well, I can't get into it, then don't make the claim. I feel like to make a claim, to say it strongly, to say there's evidence and research behind this, and then to say we can't talk about it that's at least difficult.
Okay, you're doing the same thing, because you're saying that there's such a thing as an objective moral standard, but we can't talk about it because there's more to it than what we can cover in a particular session.
Here's why what I did is not the same thing. Because I'm acknowledging that's a valid critique, that we could have a whole debate about moral objectivism. And I'm just saying it wouldn't be productive to go into that. You're making a claim here, right? And I said this is repugnant by any standard. Okay, I still think that argument carries at least some weight. Okay, but what you're saying now is homosexuality causes these harms intrinsically, and you're saying you just can't explain why.
Yeah, I'm saying that I don't have these findings memorized.
Okay, can you
but I am bringing up
one pathway of causation why intrinsically homosexuality causes some of these harms?
So okay, go ahead if you're going to answer it. But I was just going to say I don't think it's I don't think it's appropriate for Phil to press you to go on the objective moral standard if you've admitted, hey, if you don't want to answer that at this point, you don't think it's appropriate. That's respectful. But I also want to respect Phil. If he doesn't want to go down this route, let's just put a pin in it that, okay, this is a question that deserves to be answered maybe in a different show or something like that, and leave it there. But
okay, I'm okay with that, but I feel like I should register at least some sort of objection, because that's a really hurtful claim to a lot of people, right? You could say all day and all night, Tavo doesn't have any objective moral standards, and I would go, well, and I could argue about that, but it didn't hurt my feelings in the end. What you're saying is really a very hurtful thing to a lot of people, and I feel like to not address that and to put a claim out there that said, and I mean, I'm a professor and a medical doctor, right? And you're putting a claim out that doesn't seem to me like there's be any physiological or pathological basis for that claim, and it's hurtful to a lot of people.
I can send it to you.
I'm happy to skip over it if we want to, but I feel like I should just register. We've said something potentially really hurtful, right? Potentially doing a lot of damage to people, and we haven't really. I feel like that's.
How about Phil? Phil says he's going to send the paper, so I can post it up on my blog.
My objection is registered, so that's fine. I guess.
Yeah, that's cool. And like I said, I'll link to the.
Can we make sure that we register my objection? That your statement that prohibiting homosexuality is an affront to human dignity is question begging. I don't think that has ever gained any traction in the discussion. I don't think that's ever been acknowledged.
My statement is that homosexuality and heterosexuality are on equal footing, right? And I think you have to. I think the burden of proof falls on you if you say no. Those are somehow different categories of intimacy.
So
No, the burden of proof is on anybody making any claim. So if you make a claim that the prohibition against homosexuality is an affront to human dignity, then the burden of proof is on you to support that claim. And you haven't supported that claim. It's question begging.
Okay, so I'll just skip what I was going to do, but
No, go ahead,
I was going to ask this. So an audience, Brian asked this, and this is to Phil's point. So I was going to raise this anyways, but Phil is absolutely correct. As a logician, he is correct that you are making the initial claim here, Tavo. So you have a burden of proof. And on that front, so Brian asks, how are you defining an affront to human dignity? And correct me if I'm wrong, Tavo, I think you did define it. You said it, basically it's forcing homosexuals to, quote unquote, deny who they are. So yeah, in the first place, I don't want to put words in your mouth if I've misunderstood you. Is that how you define affront to human dignity? And then there is that question of the burden of proof. Like, how you can't just say the Bible is making people deny who they are, as though their homosexuality is their identity or something like that. You would need to prove that, because obviously from a Christian perspective, that's in contention and that sort of thing. So is that fair, Tavo? Does that make sense?
Yeah, and maybe homosexuality is not an affront to human dignity is maybe the wrong way to word this. The way that I might word this that might be a little more neutral is that the Christian condemnation of homosexuality is objectively harmful to people. People are hurt by it, and it's to my reading of the Bible, it's not justified on a scriptural basis, and to any reading of objective morality, it's not justified by any reading of morality. I don't, and I think to say, and here's the argument that I would come back to. If you're saying that we have to take this class of people and treat them in a different way for reasons that, at least to me, seem arbitrary, that's a problematic claim. And I think you have to justify that. I think if somebody says, I have to justify, we have to treat this, you're not clearly defining what's an affront to human dignity. I think my argument would be like, well, you're taking one group and you're denigrating that group relative to everybody else based on no moral criteria that I can discern. I think that in itself is a prima facie argument. And if you're saying that's not justified, then the burden of proof is on you to say, no, this group merits worse treatment for this reason.
The burden of proof is on you to establish that people are actually, that the Bible actually prescribes that people mistreat others if they practice homosexuality. The Bible does not teach that people should be mistreated if they practice homosexuality. What's happening is that many Christians are mistreating homosexuals because they practice homosexuality. The mistreatment of homosexuals is not a matter of love. It's not loving your neighbor. Well, so the burden of proof is on you to show that Christianity itself actually endorses the mistreatment of human beings because they practice homosexuality or because they practice any other sin that the Bible condemns. The Bible does not do that, and that's not what Christians are supposed to do. Again, we're getting back to Christians behaving badly. There are a lot of Christians who have who have hurt and harmed homosexuals because of their condemnation of homosexuals, and they've let that translate into bad treatment of human beings. And Christians should never mistreat other human beings simply because they practice something that the Bible condemns. What Christians are called to do is love people who are violating biblical moral principles. Because when you violate biblical moral principles, according to Christians, according to the Christian worldview, then that is what actually denigrates their human dignity. That's what denigrates their health. That's what denigrates their flourishing. And so if a Christian loves a homosexuality, then they're going to do two things. First of all, they're going to accept them as human beings. They're going to advocate for their rights as human beings. They're going to uphold their dignity of human beings. And at the same time, they're going to inform the homosexual that their practice is hurting them. Their practice is not what God originally designed for them. And therefore, to love someone is to help them out, help them escape what is going to be harmful to them. It's not that Christians are harming homosexualities, it's that or homosexuals, it's that homosexuality harms homosexuals.
Here's the problem.
If a Christian loves a homosexual, then they're going to try to help them out of that problem and help them escape what is doing harm to them. That's what love is.
Here's the problem. A lot of this rhetoric is very, very offensive to me personally, and could be very offensive to a lot of homosexuals listening to this. Okay, I think anyone from the LGBT community would be very offended by the fact that we're taking it on face value without any argumentation that homosexuality is harmful. Again, we've talked about, so I don't know that I want to recap that same conversation that we just had, but I think it's harmful to say homosexuality is harmful without providing any evidence, any analysis other than research that's been suppressed or an assertion.
There is evidence that homosexuality is harmful, and if anyone wants to see it, I'm happy to provide it. And so
I would encourage people actually look at my video about whether or not it's okay to be LGBTQT and Christian at the same time. That's a totally different argument, but I would recommend you check out that, because I feel like, again, I have to, at least on a rhetorical critique-based basis, say a lot of these statements are really morally repugnant to me. We should not be set aside one group and treat them. Let me finish. I let you talk for a long time on this. And this is something that I feel like I have to state stridently, because this is an important moral point. We are not living up to a high ethical standard, even in this conversation, which is supposed to be defending Christianity. I think that's really, really problematic, man. I don't see any, there's no evidence, there's no analysis that homosexuality is harmful, and repeating the statement that's already, and that statement is itself harmful to people. That's a harmful statement. And you're talking about people being suppressed. I have been suppressed. The one community I found spiritual refuge in said, take down that video. That's suppression. That's censorship. Mm-hmm. That's hurtful to me. And I'll tell you, by any ethical standard, egalitarian, any humanitarian treatment, just treating people equitably or equally across the spectrum, without relying on some narrow or arbitrary criteria that you're just pulling out of the air, I would say that's morally harmful by anyone's ethical standard. And I feel like we can talk about more standards, but I feel like I have to again stridently object to the language that's being used here.
Okay, you can object to it all day long, but here's the problem: there's a flawed principle involved in what you're saying, and that is that if somebody is offended by something, it is therefore morally problematic. So there is a group of people out there.
Well, you're making a harmful statement.
Let me turn it back on you, because you objected to me interrupting you, so I'm going to object to you interrupting me now. Okay. The idea that if somebody says that something is morally problematic, if the idea that is morally problematic in and of itself because it harms the people, it offends the people that hear it, that is a fallacy. That is a fallacy of relevance. The fact that somebody is offended by a particular articulation of a moral principle does not say anything about whether that moral principle is valid or invalid, true or false.
I can give you more evidence of the harm that you're causing by this. Okay, I'll turn it back over to you, Dale. Go ahead.
Right. And Tavo, I'm going to give you the last word, because this is a passionate thing for you. So just
harm does not determine truth. That's what needs to be said. But harm does not determine truth or falsity.
Your whole appeal, which had no evidence and no basis, by the way, again, was
that that's not true.
Your whole appeal was that homosexuality is harmful. That was your whole appeal. So now you're saying harm doesn't really matter?
No, I'm saying that.
All right, let me have my last word on this, and then we can move on, because I do want to respect Dale's wishes in facilitating.
Well, I was gonna let me ask a couple things. First of all, Tavo, again, like, I'm gonna be respecting Phil's sources and posting up. You mentioned a video of yours, giving your side, so I want to post that up as well. But just for the audience, number one, is that a scriptural based argument? Is that you kind of saying the scriptures don't teach that homosexuality is a sin, or is it more on the science based? I'm just curious.
It's a little bit of both, but it's predominantly scriptural. It's predominantly biblical. That's saying that it's outside of the confines of this debate. But but
Okay,
let me say again that these are harmful statements. They're hurting people. They're offending people. That's one category of harm. There's other categories of propagating harm that stem off of this, and there's several. Right, isolating people from the people that they love. That's harmful. Tearing families asunder. That's harmful. Sending people to conversion camps. That's harmful. By saying homosexuality is wrong, by saying it's harmful, by saying it's morally repugnant, without having an objective criteria, you are potentiating all of these practices that we know psychologically, medically. There's a mountain of research showing that these are all terrible things. Losing your family, being forced into homelessness, having to contemplate suicide. These are all things that are tremendously harmful, and we are tacitly endorsing those things by making statements without any justification in this debate.
No, we're not. No, we're not.
Well, let's move on.
We're absolutely not.
okay.
Yeah, harm does not determine truth.
Let's not keep revisiting this. Let's give the floor back to Dale so we can move on from this topic. I've said my piece.
Okay, fair enough. I'll just move on at this point. I did have one last question, but I think it. Okay, so I'll move on to the other topics. Is there any other topics that we haven't covered in terms of your objections? We've gone over environmentalism, homosexuality, debt, animal welfare. I think we covered. Well, actually, is there anything on animal welfare? Because I don't think we covered that in depth. Was there anything on that front?
I mean, James Fodor, I think, makes the case quite persuasively that there's a lot of silence on this from any scriptural resources. No, I did cite some scriptural resources but I think in this area, they're particularly tenuous. But I think animal suffering is something that everyone should be able to get behind. And again, maybe there are some Christians who have spoken out against this. I don't know that the banner of Christianity has been waved on any side of that moral argument. I'm happy to listen to your counter arguments to that, though.
Okay.
Phil, if you have anything you wanted to say about that, or if you think we've covered it.
Well, I mean, I think we've covered it in general. I think we've covered the fact that the two fundamental points here, I think we've already covered, but I think they can bear repeating because we can apply it to the animal suffering or the treatment of animals issue. And that is that just because Christians are not involved in big, serious campaigns against the unethical treatment of animals says nothing about whether Christianity is true or false. It says nothing about whether Jesus Christ is who he claimed to be or whether he's not who he claimed to be. And so all it says is that Christians are not very good at defending the ethical treatment of animals. And I would raise my hand and I would say guilty as charged. Christians do not do a good job of defending the ethical treatment of animals. Again, so what? I'm sorry, but it doesn't say anything about whether Christianity is true or false. It doesn't say anything about who Jesus is. It doesn't say anything about whether the gospel is true. And so it's ultimately irrelevant, even though it is sociologically important. It's sociologically impactful. It has sociological weight, but it has no theological or philosophical coherence. It doesn't, the conclusion does not follow from the premise. And not only that, but whether or not human beings should be kind to animals and whether or not animals suffer, those are also two different issues. And so, again, all of these objections belong in the same category. Christians are failures. Christianity can still be true, even if Christians are failures. Now, if Christians are failures, then they have lost the culture. And I absolutely agree with that, and I am extremely sympathetic to you, Tavo, for raising these objections. I sympathize with you wholeheartedly that Christians have failed. and Christians have lost the culture. And that is something that I grieve in my heart. But the issues are not that cut and dry. They are not that simple. And you're presenting one side of these issues that is extremely one-sided, and it doesn't necessarily take into account some of the counter arguments against some of the objections that you're talking about. And so you're presenting these as though these are foregone conclusions, and as though these are settled issues. And my message to you is they are not settled issues. But even if they were, it still doesn't prove what you think it proves. And what you think it proves is that Christianity does not carry any epistemic weight because of the fact that Christians have behaved badly. And that is the overall critique that I have. And I think if you continue to propagate this idea, that this argument that the failure of Christians on the world stage has a direct impact on whether or not Christianity is true or false, I think that that's going to be less than productive, because you're standing on ground that is not necessarily very solid, even though a lot of your moral objections carry weight, and a lot of your moral objections are things that Christians need to pay attention to. I believe that I need to pay attention to some of the issues that you've raised. I absolutely believe that I do. And I absolutely believe that the body of Christ should pay more attention to these issues. But they should not simply accept your version of these issues and your indictment of Christians based on these issues, because these issues are not necessarily settled the way that you think they are.
You don't think animal suffering, you don't think it's a one-sided issue? There's too much animal suffering in the world? Is that not a one-sided?
I think that whether animals suffer is a philosophical question that is not necessarily settled. It is not a settled issue.
Whether they suffer is an unsettled question?
Yes, it is an unsettled question philosophically. And not only that, but the other side to this, though, is
you're saying that animals are not capable of suffering?
I'm saying that is a disputed issue in the world of philosophy. That there are some people who say that animals are capable of suffering, and there are others who say that animals are not capable of suffering, or that there is insufficient evidence that animals are capable of suffering. But the other issue is probably more important. The other issue is, should human beings treat animals with kindness and respect? And for a Christian, that issue is probably a wholesale settled, because as far as a Christian is concerned, we are tasked with having dominion over the earth, that we are responsible as the custodians of our planet and of our environment. God has given man the responsibility to take care of the earth in which we live. And part of taking care of the earth, and part of our virtuous status as human beings, is that we treat animals with kindness, and that we don't indiscriminately cause harm or destruction to the animal world that God has created. Because if you disrespect his creation, you're disrespecting the creator. So if you want to bring up the issue that human beings should be kind to animals, and Christians have failed in the task of being kind to animals, then I would stand with you on that issue. And I would agree with you that Christians have failed. Because
the first thing that you could do to stand with me on that argument is not deny that animals are capable of suffering. I don't know of any philosopher who would oppose that argument. I can tell you from a neuroscience and cognitive and psychological and physiological standpoint, animals can suffer. There's no one-sidedness about that. There's no neuroscientist in the world is going to tell you that animals don't suffer and only humans experience suffering.
Okay, Tavo, are you familiar with the philosophy of science?
Yeah. But I don't know of any philosopher who is there somebody in that field who said animals don't suffer? The validity of the conclusions and findings of people who say that animals are capable of suffering depends on
the validity of their scientific methods and the validity of their scientific presuppositions. And all those presuppositions are philosophical. They are not scientific. So the philosophy of science is upstream from scientific findings. There are a lot of people who would call into question the methods and the conclusions and the philosophical coherence of going from animals feel pain to animals suffer. Animals feel pain is a physiological issue. Animal suffering is a philosophical, emotional issue. It is an ontological and metaphysical issue. It is not a scientific issue. And so this is far more complicated than you're giving it credit for.
I don't think it is. I'm defining suffering as inclusive of pain.
Okay, well, pain includes suffering, but not all suffering is necessary.
Well, I mean, it's nice to say, oh, this is an ontological question. This is like.
Let's not get.
Oh, go ahead, Dale.
Yeah.
I'll just say, if you want to see a debate, so I'm in the middle, actually. I disagree with Phil, but I would also disagree with you, Tavo. So I take William Lane Craig's view, which is animals definitely experience the sensation of pain, but there's a second order level of suffering and stuff, and I don't think animals. So it is a respectable debate, and I did a show where Phil was kind of arguing that kind of thing, but so yeah, I'll just
the idea of animal suffering is not settled. The idea of animal pain is probably pretty much settled.
I'll tell you from the neuroscience literature, which I'm very well aware of, it is a settled issue.
Yeah, that they feel pain.
Suffering.
That they feel pain.
Suffering.
No, pain.
No, I'm
So
telling you, I know
conflating
fMRI literature on this.
You're conflating pain with suffering. Pain is a physiological response. Suffering is an emotional, metaphysical state. They are not the same thing.
Okay,
so all suffering might involve pain, but not all pain necessarily involves suffering.
It's easy for you to make that argument, make that philosophical distinction. I think
you guys, are we going to just argue all the time? I'll just say Tavo, to support Tavo in his field. Tavo is absolutely correct that according to neuroscientists, we might think they're wrong, or you might think they're wrong, kind of thing. But neuroscientists, the vast majority, there is no question. They say they feel pain and they suffer just like us. That's just the conclusions there. But I want to move on because we can debate that maybe another time, because there is a debate to be had 100%.
Can I just say one more thing, Dale? I don't think you can have it both ways. I think if you're making the case that animals don't feel suffering, then you don't get to say, but Christians are on the side of less suffering for animals. You've just denigrated that case, right? So you can't have it both ways. But all right, I'll turn it back over to you, Dale.
Fair enough. Okay, so let's get to the audience questions and close out. We are at the 2-hour, 40-minute mark kind of thing. And all right, so the first question we have is from James, and this is starting for you, Tavo. He's asking, have you actually developed arguments for or against non-standard modern Christians? So, for example, Dostoevsky, Richard Wurmbrand, and Alexander Solzhenitsyn. I can't say that.
Dostoevsky, I'm a huge fan. If you're citing the same Dostoevsky who wrote, The Idiot and Crime and Punishment, love Dostoevsky. I've also read some of his works that have been like more theological about Christianity. I think it's very insightful. The other two figures, I've not really gone into that. So, but James, we're in touch via email, and I'm remiss for not responding to several emails from you. So if you want to send me resources to look into those latter two thinkers, I'd totally be open to that.
All right, cool. And KJEC, this one's for you, Phil, from KJEC. Isn't the only criteria for being a Christian that you have to believe in the singular divinity of Christ? As soon as you add anything else, you are moving the goalposts.
Okay, that's in quotes. So is that the actual question, or is that a quote of a question?
I'm assuming it's the question kind of thing.
Well, I think that that believing in the singular divinity of Christ is essential to being a Christian. I don't know that it is limited to that, but I think that it is essential. So if you say the only criteria for being a Christian is that you believe in the divinity of Christ, I would say, no, that's not the only criteria for being a Christian, but it is one of the criteria for being a Christian.
All right, fair enough. Another one for. Okay, it's another one for you, Phil, from again K Jack. He's as a non-believer, I rate Christianity a 2 out of 10 on moral authority. If its book was divinely inspired, wouldn't we expect it to be rated 10 out of 10? I guess by most people, including himself.
Well, if the book, the Bible, if the Bible was divinely inspired, that does not guarantee that people are going to rate Christianity a 10 out of 10. Because there's a difference between truth and being convincing. So the Bible could be divinely inspired and could be 100% true, but that doesn't mean that everybody is automatically going to be convinced just because it's true. There are a lot of things that are absolutely true and that we could support and we could defend on a rational basis, but that doesn't mean that people are going to be convinced by it. There are a lot of people that are not convinced of something that can be proven to be true. So whether he personally rates Christianity on a 2 out of 10 doesn't really have any relevance, because we can't expect that everybody would rate Christianity, or that any given person like Kajek would rate Christianity a 10 out of 10 simply because it's true. They just might not be convinced. So it's really two separate questions. And so how anybody personally rates it doesn't really have any relevance. I'm starting to repeat myself, so I'll shut up.
No problem. Tavo, I'll let you respond to this. I'll have both of you respond to the last two questions. So yeah, what's your take on this question as well?
I think the teachings of Jesus are fascinating, and I don't think they're credited enough. He inspired things in interesting ways. I think you have to separate out the question of evaluative criteria versus moral contentions. And I really think that, I know that sounds like a very nerdy point, but I do think it's important. And the reason is because I think there's a lot of things missing from the Bible, but are those things the moral contentions that are missing, or are they the evaluative criteria? In other words, Jesus gives us a set of moral standards. He gives us a set of moral scales. Now, the way we should use those moral scales are delineated by aphoristic understandings, right? He's saying, here's a story about this situation, and that becomes an aphorism. Now, you can contextualize, internalize, and apply an aphorism in a different way. So one of the other defenses, I think, against my argument would be just that Jesus is not in the Bible intending to give you a prescriptive list of the right moral decision in every circumstance. He gives you an aphorism. Those are kind of, there's a set of, it's like getting a set of moral scales, and then we're kind of on our own on how we apply those scales. Now, I do want to underscore that again, I think Jesus' teachings are in some regards underrated. Like Hannah Arendt, who was an atheist, who made, she was very influential in the field of political science. The whole study of the banality of evil is all credited with her. She was very inspired by the teachings of Jesus, not in any theological way, just thought that those were interesting teachings. The same can be said of Soren Kierkegaard, who became the father of all existentialist thought. Existentialism actually came from the teachings of Jesus. The inverted, internalized kingdom of morality, that's actually what inspired the entire framework of moral existentialism that Soren Kierkegaard came up with. And there are plenty of other examples, like George Bernard Shaw, who was a strident atheist, actually borrowed a lot of the teachings of Jesus to write the things that he wrote about socialism, both in himself and in his own fictional writings. Really fascinating stuff. My point is this: I think the teachings of Jesus are undercredited. I agree that they're not giving us a way to approach 10 out of 10 morality, right? Because they're giving us a set of scales, and it's an aphoristic set of scales. We have a densely aphoristic set of teachings, and then we have to apply those aphorisms with our own moral insights. And sometimes in that regard, we're on our own. So we'll never get to 10 out of 10. But Kajek, it's nice to hear from you. I'm glad you're in the conversation, and it's nice to be on the same side of this argument in some instances in the chat. So thanks for showing up for this. I think you came from my channel, from my post, so I appreciate it.
All right, awesome. So there was a last question. I think I lost it somewhere in the mix, but it was very short and simple, and it's something that I think was crucial between you guys, and was even causing some friction and that sort of thing. But we've been talking about this notion of what is a vice, what is this thing that causes harm. But this questioner asks the opposite. What for you, starting with you, Tavo, what is a virtue? Like, how do we define that? Yeah. Like, how do we know what benefits and what is virtuous for us?
Yeah, that's my theological contentions that I make on my channel are based on, quantitative and comparative arguments. So I look at other religions and I kind of weigh things quantitatively, and I look at historical events and I kind of weigh the evidence quantitatively. What defines a virtue? I don't know. I probably couldn't define it any better than Jesus did. Love God with all your heart, all your mind, and all your soul. Love your neighbor as yourself. If you're trying to do all both of those things, the rest of the laws kind of hang off of them. Now, I define loving God a little more broadly than some people do. I incorporate loving God with your mind as studying God, which means studying the universe, right? If you want, and I think I incorporate love and knowledge as conjoined actions. So I take that first rule and I make it a little more broad and a little more applicable. But I'm not the first person to do that. Thomas Aquinas, Augustine of Hippo, many other early Christian thinkers did that. In fact, the Gospel of John arguably does a very good job of that, of equating love and knowledge. So I had a great conversation with somebody on my channel about, is Alex O'Connor going to hell? And my argument was no, because he is loving God. He may not be doing it purposefully or knowingly, but he is studying the universe by learning everything he does about science and philosophy. And I think if you're learning everything you can and you're staying humble, that's an act of love towards the universe, and transitively, therefore, an act of love towards God. Good question. I don't know that I have a great answer for it. That's about as close as I can get to a passable answer, probably.
Yeah, no problem. And Phil, like I said, I'll get you to come back on that. Like, you guys have discussed a lot about vices and harms and stuff. What for you is a virtue? What is that about?
Well, I like Tavo's answer. I think that virtue has to do with loving God. I think virtue has to do with using our minds responsibly. So yeah, I wouldn't argue with anything that Tavo said as far as virtue is concerned. I think virtue is born out of love. I think if you love God, then you are going to be inspired to do good, to love your neighbor, to do good for your neighbor, to help those who are in need, and to not do intentional harm where it is not necessary. There are times when certain kinds of things that some people might consider harm are actually necessary, and that is not necessarily outside of the domain of virtue. But those are sticky philosophical and moral issues that it would take a long time to unpack. But in general, I think Tavo's got a good handle on it, and the Bible definitely does link knowledge of God with love of God, and it links love of God with loving your neighbor, because the Bible says, if you do not love your neighbor whom you have seen, or you do not love your brother whom you've seen, then you cannot love God whom you have not seen. So I think I like that answer quite a bit. I would give Tavo a thumbs up, and I would give him a 10 out of 10 for that answer.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that does it as far as the questions as I can see. Yeah, I think we've kind of covered everything on that front. So yeah, I just want to say thank you to both the guests for coming on. I know, like I said, there was some times when things got heated, but at the end of the day, obviously, look, I put this show on because I care about Tavo. He's a friend of mine, and as Christians, me and Phil, we're commanded to love you, and we want to help you see the truth as we see it, and try to bring you on, and sometimes we have to discuss stuff that gets uncomfortable, but I always appreciate, Tavo, that you are always a gentleman and you're willing to come on and take the other side seriously, even when it's something you're passionately disagreeing with and stuff. So I'm really thankful to both Phil and Tavo for coming on, and regardless of any heat, okay, sometimes that happens, but if we care about the truth and we care about each other, it's worth it to do this. So I hope both Tavo, you feel the same way.
That's where the discussion of love and knowledge actually translates into discussion of love and truth, because you cannot separate love from truth. So if you love someone, then you are going to not only do whatever you can to promote their highest good, but you are also going to do everything you can to help them embrace the truth. And if you don't do that, then I think that we have failed to love our neighbor. So to divorce love from truth, I think can be a huge mistake and can lead to a huge pathology, because there are people who think that loving somebody simply says, then you can never disagree with them. You can never disapprove of anything they do if you really love them. And I don't think that's the Christian perspective at all. The Christian perspective says if you really love someone, you're going to challenge them if they are going off the path, and if they're heading in a direction that is going to be harmful to them. And so to really love someone is to help them embrace the truth. And you can do that in a way that is gentle and loving, but there are times when you have to tell the truth, and the truth will set you free. So yeah, so that's good. And thank you, Tavo, for coming on, and thank you for putting up with all my contentiousness. I appreciate that. You've been very patient with me, and I hope that I've been patient with you as well. So
yeah, Tavo.
Yeah, I mean, just some quick closing words. Dale, you're a really underappreciated gem in the whole theological field. I feel like people should get more into your arguments. I hope people check out your resources. And I've been on the channel a few times, but Dale, you've been probably my best friend on YouTube to like promoting my work. So I'm really, really appreciative. And besides that, like, I feel like I'm getting promoted by somebody who's a really, really huge giant in this field. You really have done a lot. I didn't, even the first couple of times I dove into your arguments a little bit, but every time I do a deeper dive, I realize there's more resources there. It's really fascinating stuff. So now, if people haven't seen me before, I would recommend going to my channel and checking out some of my content. It's a little more articulate and a little more spelled out than what I've done in this debate. So please check that stuff out. As far as you, Phil, no, you've been a gentleman, and you've been really kind, and you've got a great YouTube channel and great content. And I hope that this is the beginning of a friendship. And I feel like I can argue with somebody and disagree with them, and I can even disagree with them stridently and still respect them as a friend. And I really think that's important. And I hope that this is the beginning of a friendship. And I hope we have more conversations about this. And I'd love to engage with you further on any of the topics that we've brought up today, except for the moral relativism. But other than that, yeah. But I think one of the provisos and preconditions that we had for this debate is that if we didn't come to a consensus understanding, if we didn't agree, then Phil and I had to duel it out with a guitar battle. So I'm ready. I've got my Strat out by my side, so I'm ready for that next.
Oh, nice, boy. We should just do a whole show on guitars.
Sure. I'd love that too. No, you'd floor me. But you great guitar work on your channel too. So
I had no idea that you were a musician or a guitarist.
Yeah, people who hear me play also afterwards have no idea that I'm a musician or guitarist. So you're not alone.
You have just shocked another YouTube channel with that revelation there, Tavo. Wait, what?
I posted something on Facebook a couple of days ago that I got from an advertisement for a T-shirt, and the T-shirt said "World's most okayest guitarist." Most okay, and it says he let's see, he plays loud and tries to make sure he's in tune, and so that makes me the world's most okayest guitarist. I don't consider myself the world's best guitarist by any stretch of the imagination. And whenever I meet a guitarist, my assumption is always he's probably a better player than I am, because I have a long way to go. So,
yeah. Awesome. Well, we will have that guitar battle the next time Phil and Tavo face off.
Oh, I wouldn't want it to be a battle. I would want it to be a celebration. I'd want it to be like a guitar consortium, where we compare notes and learn from each other. That would be fun, because
Sure.
I have a lot to learn.
Yeah.
Fair enough. All right, cool. So yeah, with that said, I will wrap up. We are almost at the 3-hour mark. So yeah, great show, everybody. And just so you know, what I have in the next couple of special shows. So Next week, I have two shows. One of them on Saturday will be with the famous biblical scholar, Dr. Jonathan McLatchie, world famous. He's great with philosophy and logic and also the intelligent design debate and stuff. And specifically, we're going to be discussing the conversion of the Apostle Paul. He has an argument that he thinks from the conversion of Paul alone proves not only the reportage model of Acts, but also proves that Christianity is true in itself. So we don't need the other disciples or anything. Paul says it all. Another thing coming up in the next couple of weeks that will be interesting. So Tavo was in the role of the skeptic today. Guess who else is going to be in the skeptic seat in a couple of weeks' time? Me. So I'm going to do a debate on the resurrection with Juan from Modern Atheism. Phil and Tavo both know Juan. And it's on the debating the resurrection, but I'm going to be the resurrection skeptic, and Juan is going to be the Christian. It's a devil's advocate debate. And I think these are very important. It helps get past the same old talking points. You know, as a Christian, I've gotten used to arguing for the resurrection. I know my points, and Juan knows his skeptical points. This forces us to think from the other side and try to steel man in good faith the other side. So I think that is a helpful exercise. So that'll be, I think Juan will be posting it up on his channel Easter weekend. So those are a couple things to look forward to. But otherwise, have a great day, everybody, and take care. All right.